Howdy folks, you're watching Game of Theories. Sit tight because today we bring you, what if Jon Snow was reborn knowing he'd be betrayed at the wall? Smash that like, subscribe and enjoy the ride. Chapter 1. The second morning the smell hit him first. Pine resin and cold stone and the particular kind of wood smoke that only ever came from Winterfell's great hearths, the ones that burned night oak and never fully went out, not even in summer. Jon Snow lay flat on his back and breathed it in and did not move for a long time, because he understood, with the strange crystalline certainty of a man who had already died once, exactly where he was, and exactly when. The ceiling above him was the ceiling of his old room in Winterfell. The same water stain near the eastern corner that looked like a charging aurochs if you squinted. The same gray light pressing through the narrow window, the kind of pale northern morning that never quite committed to sunrise. He could hear the yard below, stable boys calling to each other, the clang of a farrier already at work, the distant sound of Bran laughing at something. Bran. Jon closed his eyes, pressed his palms flat against the rough wool blanket beneath him, and breathed slow and steady, the way Maester Luwin had taught him once when he was 8 years old and terrified of a fever dream. Name what you know, Luwin had said. Name it and it becomes smaller. He knew this. He had been Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He had been murdered in the yard of Castle Black, 17 stab wounds in the cold and the dark, each one from a man he had called brother. He had died looking up at the same kind of pale northern sky, and the last thing he had felt was not rage or grief but something worse, a dull, terrible surprise that it had come to this, that all of it had come to this. He knew this. His name was not Jon Snow. He knew this. The dead were coming and no one was ready, and if he did nothing differently, everyone he loved would burn or freeze or both. Jon opened his eyes and sat up. Ghost was curled at the foot of the bed, enormous even now. No, wait. He looked again. Ghost was small. A pup, red-eyed and white as new snow, barely the size of a man's forearm, making a sound in his sleep that was somewhere between a growl and a whimper. Jon stared at the direwolf for a moment with an expression no one would have called anything other than profound relief. He reached out and put his hand gently on the pup's flank, felt the small ribs rise and fall, and something in his chest loosened just slightly. "All right," he said quietly, to Ghost, to himself, to the ceiling maybe. "All right." He dressed quickly and without ceremony, pulling on breeches and a shirt and his boots by feel in the gray morning light, and then he paused at the window. Below, Winterfell was waking up in all its ancient, unbroken routine, the same yard, the same stones, the same people moving through their same patterns, none of them knowing. Ned Stark crossed the yard below in his heavy cloak, heading toward the great hall, and Jon watched him walk with the particular careful stillness of a man trying very hard not to shatter. His father, not his father, the man who had raised him and kept his secret and died on his knees on a sept floor in King's Landing, because he had been too honest for the world he lived in. Ned Stark was alive. Jon watched him until he disappeared through the great hall doors and then turned away from the window, because standing there mooning about it wouldn't save anyone. He had work to do. He knew the date the way he knew his own heartbeat. It was the morning of the day King Robert Baratheon arrived at Winterfell, which meant Jon had perhaps 6 hours before the feast, before the offer Ned could not refuse, before the cascade of catastrophic decisions that had eventually ended with the world on fire. He had 6 hours in Winterfell before everything began moving again, and he intended to use every one of them. The first thing he did was find Arya. She was in the armory, which he had expected. She was always in the armory when she wasn't supposed to be, stealing looks at the practice blades with hungry eyes. He found her standing on her toes trying to reach a short sword hung just slightly too high on the rack, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, And for a moment Jon Snow simply stood in the doorway and looked at her, and his throat did something complicated and involuntary. She was 10 years old. She was alive. She was the scrappiest, most infuriating, most beloved creature he had ever known. And the last time he had seen her she had been sailing away on a ship with wolves carved into the hull, and he had not known if he'd ever. "Are you going to help me or just stand there breathing?" Arya said, without turning around. "How'd you know it was me?" "Your boots. You walk like you're trying to sneak up on someone. You always have." She turned then, and her face was open and unembarrassed in the way that it would eventually stop being, years from now, after everything. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, quick and bird-like. "You look weird." "I look exactly the same." "No, you don't. You've got a face like you've been thinking too hard." She abandoned the sword and came toward him, studying him with the particular unsettling attention that had always made her seem older than she was. "What's wrong?" Jon looked at his little sister, his sister. He was never calling her anything else. Blood be damned, and made a decision right then. He had spent his whole first life being too slow, too careful, too afraid of disrupting the natural order of things. He had let people walk into their own graves because he hadn't wanted to seem strange. Because he hadn't wanted to explain things he couldn't fully explain. Because he was Jon Snow, the quiet one, the careful one, the one who watched and waited and bled quietly in the dark. That was done. He sat down on a crate of arrow shafts and looked Arya in the eye. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting until I'm finished. Can you do that?" "Probably not," she said honestly. "Try." She sat cross-legged on the floor in front of him, which was so fundamentally Arya that it almost broke him open right there. He breathed once. "I know what's going to happen. Not guessing, not dreaming, I know. Robert Baratheon is coming today, and he's going to ask Father to be his hand, and Father's going to say yes, and that's going to be the beginning of—" He stopped, reorganized. "Bad things are going to happen to this family, Arya, terrible things. But I also know what we have to do to stop them, or at least to survive them, and I need you to trust me." She stared at him. He watched her work through it, the skepticism, the stubbornness, and then underneath both of those, the instinct that had always made her remarkable, the one that recognized truth even when it was inconvenient. "How do you know?" she asked. "I can't explain the how, not in a way that would make sense before breakfast. Try me, Arya, Jon." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I died," he said simply, "and then I woke up here with everything I know intact." The silence stretched for 3 full seconds. Arya's face moved through several expressions too quickly to track. Then she said with remarkable composure, "Okay, okay. You've never lied to me, not once, not even when it would have been easier." She shrugged, the gesture carrying all the casual certainty of someone who had already done the calculation and liked the answer. "So, what do I need to do?" And there it was. That was why he'd come to her first, before Robb, before anyone. Because Arya Stark would accept an impossible truth and immediately ask what was useful about it, while everyone else was still arguing about whether the truth was possible. "Train," he said. "Seriously, not just sneaking into armories. When we reach King's Landing with Father and you will go to King's Landing, tell him you need a water-dancing master. His name is Syrio Forel. Insist. Throw a fit if you have to. He's the best teacher you'll ever have, and you're going to need everything he can give you." He leaned forward. "And Arya, no matter what happens in King's Landing, no matter how bad it gets, you don't try to be a hero. You survive. That's the mission. You survive and you find your way north. Promise me." "What happens in King's Landing?" "Very bad things." "Does Father—" She stopped. Her chin went up, which was how she fought back anything that might embarrass her by leaking out her eyes. Jon reached over and took her hand. "Listen to me carefully. What happens to Father depends on choices that haven't been made yet, choices he makes. I'm going to speak to him this morning, and I'm going to try to change those choices." But if I can't, he squeezed her fingers. Your job is not to save him. Your job is to live, swear it. I swear, she said, very quietly, and he believed her. He stood, and she stood with him, and then without warning she threw her arms around his middle and pressed her face into his chest, which was not typically very Arya at all. He held on for a moment that he told himself firmly was not too long. You'd better not die again, she said into his shirt. I'll do my absolute best. Finding Ned Stark was easy, finding him alone was less so. The man was already drowning in preparations for the royal visit, moving through Winterfell with the quiet, controlled efficiency that was as much a part of him as his face. Jon tracked him to the Godswood, which was the one place Ned Stark could always be found alone, and he waited by the heart tree because some things were worth being dramatic about. Ned came through the trees 20 minutes later, stopped when he saw Jon, and the look on his face was the complicated one it always was, the particular expression of a man carrying a secret too heavy to fully hide. Jon, he said, I thought you'd be at the yard. I needed to speak with you. Privately. Jon met his father's gaze directly, without the habitual slight deference he had always shown, the posture of a bastard in a lord's household, and he watched Ned register the change with a small narrowing of the eyes. About my mother. The Godswood went very still. Ned Stark was not a man who showed much. His face was northern granite, trained from boyhood to give away nothing that could be used against him. But something moved behind those gray eyes now, a flash of something old and cornered, and Jon pressed before it could become a refusal. I know her name, Jon said. Lyanna. I know about the Tower of Joy. I know what you've been carrying since before I could walk, and I know why, and I'm not here to demand anything or accuse you of anything. You did what she asked. You kept the secret she died to protect. His voice was level and unhurried, the voice of a man who had already processed his own grief across years and couldn't afford to process it again right now. But I need you to know that I know, because what I have to tell you next is going to sound like madness, and I need you to hear it with the full understanding of who I am. Ned Stark sat down on the root of the heart tree. Jon had never seen him sit down outside of a hall. The gray in his beard caught the early light. Tell me, Ned said. So Jon told him. Not everything, not the whole sprawling catastrophe of the War of 5 Kings and the White Walkers and the Night King, but enough. He told him about the Lannisters and Cersei's secret and the ugly end that waited in King's Landing for a man too honorable to play the game. He told him about Robb and the Red Wedding, and he watched Ned's jaw tighten like a vice at that. He told him that the dead were real and moving, and that the wall would not hold forever, and that the only thing that had any hope of stopping them was a unified Westeros and 2 dragons and a Targaryen on the throne. Ned did not interrupt. He listened with the absolute focused attention of a military commander being briefed before a battle, and when Jon finished, the Godswood was silent except for wind in the leaves. You're telling me the truth, Ned said, not a question. Yes. How? I don't know, it doesn't matter. Ned looked at the heart tree. The red leaves stirred. You said you know how I die. Yes. Tell me. Jon held his gaze. Cersei Lannister arrests you for treason against Joffrey after Robert dies. Robert is going to be gored by a boar on the hunt. You need to know that. He's going to die within weeks of arriving here. Joffrey takes the throne. You find proof that Joffrey isn't Robert's son and Cersei has you taken. They take your head off in front of the great sept of Baelor. Ned was quiet. Then, and you're telling me this can be changed? I'm telling you it must be changed. If you die in King's Landing, Robb marches south in revenge and walks into a trap that kills him and your mother and half the North. Every catastrophe that follows comes from your death in King's Landing. So I need you to not die. There was something almost fierce in Jon's voice now, something that had no patience left for dignity or careful phrasing. I need you to be smarter than you were, than you would have been. I need you to lie if you have to. I need you to play the game even though you hate it, because the alternative is that your sons and your daughters scatter to the winds and the whole north burns. Ned Stark looked at his not-son for a long time. You never called me father, Ned said, and his voice had something in it Jon hadn't heard before. You're not, Jon said, and then, immediately before Ned's expression could finish moving, but you're everything that word should mean, everything I ever wanted it to mean. And I would very much like you to survive. Ned's throat worked. He looked away. When he looked back, his face was composed again, the granite mask in place, but his eyes were different. When Robert makes the offer today, what do you want me to do? Refuse it. He won't accept a refusal. I know. So you accept you go to King's Landing, but you go in armor instead of walking around with your honor strapped to your chest like it'll protect you. You trust no one except there's a man, Petter Baelish, Littlefinger. You'll know him from your childhood. Do not trust him. Whatever he tells you, whatever proof or alliance he offers, he is the reason you end up on that block. Littlefinger, Ned repeated, and something cold moved across his face. He always was too clever. He's still too clever. Assume everything he tells you is a lie arranged to look like help. Jon stood. I'm leaving for the Wall today, before the feast. I'm not going to wait for Robert to arrive. Ned looked up sharply. Why? Because I don't need the royal circus, and I don't need Tyrion Lannister's pity, and I don't need to sit through a feast pretending I don't know what's coming. I have work to do at the Wall, Father. Real work. The kind that doesn't wait for proper timing. He looked at Ned steadily. Tell Robb I'll write. Tell him not to march south for any reason until he hears from me. Any reason. Can you make him understand that? Robb doesn't always listen. But he listens to you. Make him understand. Ned stood, and for a moment they faced each other in the godswood, the Lord of Winterfell and the boy who was secretly a king, and the air between them was dense with things that didn't have words yet, things that existed in the particular register of men who are both trying to be strong and failing slightly at it. Ned reached out and gripped Jon's shoulder. His hand was very large and very steady. Come back from the Wall, he said. It was a command dressed as a request. I intend to, Jon said. Take care of my sister. Which one? Both, but Arya especially. She's going to need watching. When hasn't she needed watching? Ned said. And there was something in his voice that might have been the ghost of a smile, and Jon held on to that later, when he was on the road north and needed something solid to hold. He found Robb in the training yard, already at work with a practice blade against one of the household knights, and Jon watched his brother for a moment from the gate, the fluid confidence of him, the easy grin after a good parry, the way he wore the future lordship of Winterfell like it was simply his natural shape. He would be a good king. He had been a good king briefly, before the world took him apart. Jon entered the yard, and Robb looked over and immediately registered the same thing Arya had registered, that something was different about his brother this morning, something behind the eyes that hadn't been there before. Training, Robb called, gesturing with the practice blade. In a moment. Jon crossed the yard to him. The household knight found somewhere else to be. I'm leaving today, before the feast. Robb's grin faded. Today, Robert hasn't even, I know, I'm not waiting for Robert. He held up a hand before Robb could build momentum into an argument. I need you to hear something and keep it, Robb. Whatever happens in the south, whatever word comes from King's Landing, you do not march. Not for any reason, not without speaking to me first. Send ravens, wait for my answer, and then decide. Do you hear me? Robb's face was doing the thing it always did when he was trying to catch up to a conversation that had started without him, a kind of dignified, slightly offended concentration. What do you know? Enough to be cautious. Jon, swear to me, on Winterfell. Something in Robb's expression shifted when he heard the weight in that, the seriousness that had no room in it for games. Robb Stark was not a fool. He looked at his brother for a long moment, and then he said slowly, On Winterfell, I'll send ravens first. Good. Jon clasped his arm, the warrior's grip, and Robb gripped back hard with a questioning look that Jon didn't have time to fully answer. You'll be a good lord, Robb. You have everything it takes. Just learn to trust the people your enemies want you to distrust. Think about that. That's very cryptic and strange for a morning visit. I know, forgive me. He said goodbye to Bran, who was eating porridge in the great hall and talking about climbing, and who, when Jon hugged him, looked surprised enough that his spoon stopped moving halfway to his mouth. He said goodbye to baby Rickon, who didn't know it was goodbye, and who fell asleep on Jon's shoulder for approximately 4 minutes before a maid came to fetch him. He said goodbye to Sansa with the particular care of a man who knew that Sansa Stark was going to have the hardest road of any of them, and that she wouldn't believe that yet and couldn't be made to, not without breaking her in a different way. Be careful in King's Landing, he told her, and Sansa laughed and said there was nothing dangerous about a royal court, and Jon smiled at her and did not say the dozen things he was thinking. He found Catelyn Stark in the Solar, going over household accounts with the Maester. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her expression did the careful, complicated thing it always did with him, the thing he had spent his childhood trying not to see, and which he now saw clearly for what it was. Not hatred exactly, but the face of a woman looking at the evidence of her husband's infidelity and unable to make herself look away. Jon had once felt shame about that expression. Now he looked back at her steadily. Lady Stark, he said. I'm leaving for the Wall this morning. I wanted to say goodbye. She set down her quill. Something moved behind her eyes, surprise, maybe, or the ghost of something that might have been guilt. You could stay for the feast. The king? I don't need to meet the king, Jon said. Take care of your children, all of them. He met her gaze long enough that she understood he was not making a general statement. Then he bowed slightly and left. By mid-morning his horse was packed. His gear was minimal. He was going to the Wall, not into exile, and everything he needed was either waiting for him there or would be made. Ghost rode in a saddlebag with his red eyes visible over the top, watching the world with the preternatural calm of a creature who understood more than he let on. Jon thought sometimes that Ghost had always understood more than the rest of them. The last person he saw was Arya, standing at the gate with her arms crossed and the wind pulling her hair sideways, watching him with an expression that was trying very hard to be tough and mostly succeeding except around the eyes. You forgot something, she said, and held out a small knife. It was one of his own, a short belt dagger with a bone handle. He recognized it immediately and had no idea when she'd taken it. Did I? He took the knife. I was going to keep it, she said. Since you're clearly not using it, I'm using it now. Good. She looked up at him, the morning light making her look very young, or maybe she just was very young and he had forgotten. Come back, she said. That's not a request. I know. He reached down from the saddle and touched the top of her head, which she tolerated with an eye roll. Don't stab anyone important until you've got a teacher who can make it count. He turned his horse north before she could respond, because leaving Winterfell for the second time in his life was harder than the first, and he had already spent enough time on sentiment. He had work to do. The Kingsroad North was quiet in a way that felt, after everything, almost luxurious. The trees closed in around him, dark pine and silver birch, and Ghost slept in the saddlebag, and occasionally made small wolf sounds. And Jon Snow rode north with his memories laid out in front of him like a map of a country he'd already lost, and was going to fight like hell to reclaim. He thought about Castle Black. He thought about the men who had pushed knives into him in the dark, Ollie's face, that most of all, because Ollie had been a boy and Jon had loved him in the uncomplicated way that an older man loves a younger one who reminds him of himself. He thought about Alliser Thorne, who was a bastard of a different kind, the kind who had been shaped by cruelty into something angular and unyielding. He thought about Bowen Marsh, who had wept while he was doing it, which Jon had always found in the long dark time afterward both reprehensible and somehow the most human thing about the whole affair. He was not angry. That surprised him, sitting with it on the road north. He had expected rage, had braced for it the way you brace for a wave, and instead found something much cooler and more purposeful. He didn't want revenge on those men. He wanted to make the world into a shape where what they had done was unnecessary, where the fear that had driven them was never allowed to grow that large. But he also was not going to pretend it hadn't happened. He was not going to walk back into that yard and become the Jon Snow who could be stabbed. He was going to be something different, something the brothers of the Night's Watch had never quite had to deal with before, and some of them were going to find it uncomfortable, and he found that he genuinely did not care. He stopped for the night at a village in 3 days north of Winterfell, the kind of place that served thick black ale and mutton that had been in the pot long enough to become a matter of philosophy. He sat in the corner with his back to the wall. He had done that in his second life too, but now it was habit rather than instinct, and listened to the room around him. 2 merchants arguing about the price of wool, a farmer with bad teeth telling a story about a wolf pack that had come close to his cattle, 3 young men from somewhere south who were very drunk and very loud about it. Nobody looked at him twice. He was just another young man in traveler's clothes, nothing remarkable about him, eating his mutton and feeding scraps to the white pup on his lap. He thought about what he'd told his father. He thought about the things he hadn't said, about Rhaegar and Lyanna, about the annulment that made his parents' marriage legal, about what it meant in the cold, honest light of heraldry and blood law that Jon Snow did not exist, and Aegon Targaryen did. He had not told Ned that he intended to use that name. He wasn't sure yet when he would use it, or how. But he knew that he would use it, because the problem with his first life was that he had spent the whole of it being shaped by other people's versions of who he was, and he was done with that. He was Aegon Targaryen. He had fire in his blood, and before this life was over, the whole world would know what that meant. He reached Castle Black on the 19th day of riding, coming up the King's Road in the slate-gray light of a northern afternoon, the wall ahead of him impossibly large and impossibly silent, 600 and some odd feet of magic-locked ice standing between the world of men and the darkness beyond. Jon looked up at it from the base of the switchback road and felt the cold come off it like a breath from something old and patient. He had missed it. He hadn't expected that, the missing of it, but there it was. Castle Black was a ruin of a place, badly undermanned and badly maintained and fundamentally broken in half a dozen institutional ways. But it was also the wall, and the wall was the only thing standing between 8 million people and the dead. And Jon Snow had given his life to that truth once already, and he was here to give it again, but this time on his own terms. The gate guard watched him ride up with the mild suspicion of a man performing a ritual he'd performed 1,000 times before. Jon dismounted and gave his name. Jon Snow of Winterfell, bastard son of Lord Eddard Stark. I'm here to take the Black. The guard looked him over. The direwolf in the saddlebag had attracted some attention and sent for the steward. Jon stood in the yard of Castle Black and looked around at it. The practice yard, half covered in old snow, the armory, the king's tower, the common hall, and across the yard, coming toward him with the particular rolling walk of a man who owned every inch of ground he walked on, Sir Alistair Thorne, the master-at-arms, the man who would, in another life, lead the group that killed him. Thorne stopped 3 feet away and looked Jon over with the flat assessment of a man pricing livestock. Another lordling come to be a ranger, Thorne said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a greeting. Just a bastard, Jon said pleasantly. I'm told you're the best training master this side of the wall. Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. He was not used to recruits who looked at him like that, steady and unimpressed and faintly, carefully amused. "You've been told wrong," Thorne said. "I'm the only training master this side of the wall. Follow me." Jon followed him, leading his horse with one hand and Ghost drowsing in the crook of his other arm, and he looked around the courtyard that had been, in another life, the place where he died, and he felt a kind of clean, fierce determination settle over him like armor. He was home. He was here. And everything was about to change. That evening, after he'd been processed and assigned quarters, and given the standard explanation of the watch's rules and expectations by a tired steward who had clearly given the same speech enough times to have stopped believing it, Jon stood on the wall for the first time in this life. The elevator, the great cage lift, ground up its track in the long, familiar way, and then he was on top, 700 feet of air beneath him, the world on both sides. To the south, the green and gray of the gift stretching toward the horizon, dotted with farms and forests and the distant smear of smoke from small villages. To the north, the haunted forest rolling out dark and enormous, and beyond it the pale, open country of the true north, and beyond that, somewhere that couldn't be seen from here, the Night King and his dead were moving. Jon stood on the wall in the cold wind and looked north for a long time. He had been afraid in his first life. He had been afraid almost constantly, though he'd been trained to keep it from his face. Afraid of failure, afraid of inadequacy, afraid of the great yawning question of his own identity. He had been afraid right up until the moment he stopped being alive, and even then he wasn't sure the fear had fully left. He was not afraid now. He was something else, something harder and more angular and strangely light with it, the way a blade is light after proper tempering. He had been given something extraordinary and terrible this second morning, this second chance, and he had no intention of wasting a single hour of it. The wind came off the north hard and cold, tasting of ice and distance and something else, something that had no name in the language of living men, the particular breath of a world that wanted to swallow everything south of this wall and had been patient about it for 10,000 years. Jon Snow breathed it in and didn't flinch. "I know you're out there," he said quietly, to the darkness, to the cold, to the army of the dead that was gathering somewhere in all that northern black. "I've seen what you do, and I promise you it goes differently this time." Ghost appeared at his knee, silent as smoke, and sat and looked north with him, red eyes bright in the last gray light. Below them, Castle Black was lighting its evening fires. Jon Snow watched the darkness and began, in the careful, organized way of a man who has already lived through the consequences of poor planning, to prepare. Chapter 2. The Shape of the Blade. The recruits arrived in batches over the following 2 weeks, trickling in from every corner of Westeros the way refuse trickled into a drain, the dispossessed, the desperate, the criminal, and the occasionally idealistic. Jon watched each group ride or stumble through the gate from whatever vantage point he happened to occupy, and he cataloged them with the quiet efficiency of a man sorting through tools before a long job. Most of them he remembered. Gren arrived on the 3rd day, big and slow-speaking and earnest, with a farmer's hands and a soldier's potential buried somewhere underneath the general confusion about why he was here. Pip came a week after that, small and quick-eyed, with a mountebank's instinct for reading rooms and the particular survival intelligence of someone who had learned early that the world was not going to be kind to him. Toad, Mathar, Rast with his narrow face and his casual cruelties, the kind of man who needed someone weaker than himself the way others needed food. Jon marked them all without expression. He had spent the intervening days not wasting a single hour. The armory first. He'd introduced himself to the master smith, a taciturn man named Donal Noy who had lost his right arm at the siege of Pike, and who regarded new recruits with the professional wariness of a man who had seen too many of them bleed out from avoidable mistakes. Jon had spent 3 mornings with him discussing the castle's weapon stores, and Noy had gone from wary to cautiously interested by the 2nd morning and from interested to genuinely engaged by the 3rd, because Jon had asked him about dragonglass. Obsidian, Noy had said, setting down a chisel. You know what it does. I know what it can do, Jon had said carefully. Against certain enemies. Noy had looked at him for a long moment with the eye of a man who measured things for a living. Lord Commander Mormont mentioned it once, years back, old legend, the long night. It's not a legend, Jon had said. I need to know how much we have, and I need to know if there's more at Dragonstone. Noy had not laughed at him, which was the thing Jon had liked most about Donal Noy in his first life and liked just as much now. The man had written him a careful inventory of the castle's stores and said, with the economy of someone who didn't spend words carelessly, "Talk to Mormont." Jon had talked to Mormont. The Lord Commander had received him in his solar with a raven on his shoulder, and an expression suggesting he was already tired of the meeting before it had begun. Jeor Mormont had that quality, the ability to project comprehensive exhaustion at will, which Jon suspected was how he managed a castle full of criminals and misfits and maintained his sanity. He was a large man going gray, with a beard that had given up on having a particular shape, and eyes like glacier ice, pale and very cold and capable when he chose of seeing quite far. "You're Stark's bastard," Mormont had said, not looking up from the parchment he was reading. "Yes, my lord. You're early. Recruits don't usually start training for another week. I'm aware. I was hoping to speak with you about something before training starts." Mormont had looked up then, with the slightly sharpened attention of a man who had not expected that particular sentence from a new recruit. "Speak." And Jon had chosen his words carefully, more carefully than he had with his father, where urgency had overridden strategy. He had laid out the case for dragonglass simply and without embellishment. There was an enemy beyond the wall that conventional steel wouldn't kill. The historical record in the older Night's Watch texts supported the use of dragonglass against such enemies, and the largest known deposit in Westeros was at Dragonstone, which was currently an empty castle. He had made no claims about foreknowledge. He had cited sources Mormont could actually check. Mormont had watched him through all of it with the expression of a man listening to someone speak a language he only half understood. When Jon finished, the Lord Commander was quiet for a moment, and the raven on his shoulder said corn very clearly and then went back to ignoring everyone. "You've read the old texts," Mormont said, "every one I could find, and you think the White Walkers are real. I think the wall exists for a reason, my lord. I think 10,000 years of tradition usually has something behind it." Mormont had looked at him for a long time. Then he'd said, "You're a strange boy, Stark." "Snow," Jon had said, not without some small private irony. "My name is Snow." Now 2 weeks into his time at Castle Black, Jon stood in the training yard on the first morning that all the recruits would be assembled together, and he watched Sir Alizer Thorne walk out to face them. And he positioned himself slightly apart from the group, not conspicuously, just enough to watch everyone at once. There were 14 of them, a decent crop by the Watch's recent standards. Jon knew most of their stories. The man to his left, Pip, was shivering in a thin jacket. Gren was standing with the wary stillness of someone who expected to be hit at any moment. Rast was already scanning the group for weakness the way a dog scans a yard for scraps. Thorne walked down the line. He moved the way he always had, like he owned the cold, like the wind was staff he'd hired. He had the flat, contemptuous face of a man who had made peace with not being liked and found that peace gave him a kind of freedom. He stopped in front of Jon. They looked at each other. "The bastard of Winterfell," Thorne said. "I've been hearing about you already. Making friends with the smith, making friends with the Lord Commander, asking questions about ancient magical weapons. He let that sit. You trying to make commander by the end of the first week. I'm trying to be useful, Jon said. Useful. Thorne tasted the word like it had gone off. The Night's Watch doesn't need useful. It needs men who can swing a sword without dying and follow orders without whining. Can you do that, Lord Snow? I can do considerably more than that, Jon said pleasantly. But I'll start there if it makes you comfortable. The yard went very quiet. Jon had learned in his first life to navigate Alistair Thorne through careful deference, to take the man's contempt without visible reaction, to wait him out, to trust that patience was its own form of strength. He had died having never really resolved anything with Thorne. This time, he had decided to try something different. Not aggression. Thorne would simply dig in against aggression, and he was not wrong that he commanded here, but something that offered the man a choice, something that made clear from the very first exchange that the usual strategies didn't apply to this particular recruit. Thorne's jaw tightened slightly. "Pair up," he said to the group and turned away. Jon turned to Gren. "You and me." Gren looked at him with the expression of a man who had not expected to be chosen for anything. He said carefully. They were given blunted training swords, the kind that still hurt considerably when they connected, and the yard rang with the sounds of recruits discovering that they were worse at this than they had imagined. Most of them were. Jon watched Pip get knocked down twice in 30 seconds, watched Toad swing with his elbows out in a way that would eventually get him killed, watched Rast put real aggression into his blows against the smaller boy he'd partnered with. Jon sparred with Gren with approximately 40% of his ability, which was generous given the gap, and spent the first exchange working out where Gren's actual problems were. In his first life he had been less patient about this. He had beaten the recruits efficiently and without malice, but also without much teaching, because he hadn't understood yet that the point wasn't to demonstrate his own skill. The point was to make the people around him harder to kill. "Stop," he said when Gren swung wide for the third time. Gren stopped, breathing hard. "Sorry, I don't apologize. Look at your feet. When you swing, your left foot comes up on its toes. It's why you pull wide." Jon showed him briefly the stable stance, the planted heel. "Swing again." Gren swung again, still wrong but less wrong. "Better," Jon said. "Again." Thorne was watching from the far side of the yard. Jon could feel it. He didn't look over. By the midday break, Jon had sparred with Gren, Pip, a sullen boy named Mathar, and 2 men he didn't remember from his first life whose names he was still learning. He had gone easier on some and harder on others based on what they actually needed. Pip needed to find his footing and his confidence more than he needed better technique. So Jon had let him land more than he should have, and watched the small man's spine straighten as a result. Mathar needed the opposite, needed to understand that his size wasn't going to be enough, and that something more technical had to compensate. So Jon had been quick and clinical, and watched the lesson land behind the sullen expression. Rast was watching him from across the yard during the break, eating black bread, with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic. Jon looked back at him once and held eye contact for exactly 3 seconds and then looked away. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. "I see you and I know what you are, and you should think about that." Rast looked away first. That afternoon, Thorne lined them up for assessment. He walked down the line again with a stick, tapping shoulders, assessing builds and stances, making the kind of comments that were designed to strip dignity away because men without dignity, Thorne believed, were easier to shape. It was not an entirely wrong theory. It was just applied too broadly and without sufficient intelligence about what each man actually needed. He stopped in front of Jon again. "You've been helping the others," Thorne said. "During breaks, during the morning session even, I saw you correcting Gren's footwork." "I was bored," Jon said. "You're a recruit. Recruits don't teach." Then I apologize for being ahead of the curriculum. Jon met the man's gaze with a pleasant openness that contained absolutely no apology. Though I'd argue that if someone with useful information shares it, the watch benefits regardless of who's giving the lesson. "The watch benefits from discipline," Thorne said, "not from lordlings deciding to run their own school." "I'm not a lordling," Jon said. "I'm a bastard. We're not known for school running." He paused. "I'll let Gren figure his own footwork out if it matters to you. I don't think he'll last as long, but that's your call." The other recruits had gone very still in the way that people go still when they've identified themselves as witnesses to something significant and are unsure whether they want to be. Thorne looked at him for a long, measuring moment. His face had the look of a man recalibrating. Jon watched the calculation happen, the assessment of whether this recruit was stupid and cocky, or whether there was something else here that needed a different approach. Thorne was not a fool. He was rigid and cruel in many ways, and Jon did not like him, but he was not a fool. "Full sparring," Thorne said. "You and me, after dinner." "Yes, sir," Jon said. Gren looked at him sideways as Thorne moved on. "That was brave," he whispered. "Or stupid, I can't tell which." "Neither," Jon murmured back. "Just necessary." He spent the afternoon thinking about how to handle Thorne in the sparring match because there was a meaningful difference between the choice he made in his first life and what this moment required. In his first life, he had been exceptional in the practice yard, and it had made him enemies. The other recruits had hated him for it, or been intimidated by him, and the social failure had made everything harder for months. He had corrected that by pulling back, by coaching, by investing in the people around him, which had eventually worked, but too slowly. This time he was going to do two things at once. After dinner, black bread and a stew of indeterminate origin that had nevertheless become one of the things he'd missed without realizing it, because even prison food has a kind of home to it after long enough. Jon walked into the practice yard where Thorne was already waiting with two real swords. Not blunted. Actual steel, which said something about Thorne's mood that Jon filed carefully away. The other recruits had arranged themselves along the yard's edges. So had 4 or 5 of the rangers and stewards who happened to be about, because news traveled fast in a small castle, and a good fight was better than black bread. Jon picked up the sword that Thorne indicated. It was a fair blade, mid-weight, good balance. He turned it once in his hand to feel the center of gravity, and then held it naturally, without flourish. Thorne did not offer instruction or limitation. He simply attacked. And this was the thing about Alizer Thorne that Jon had not fully appreciated in his first life. He was good, properly, technically good, the product of training that went back to a time when Westeros had real military culture and lords' sons were drilled from the time they could hold a practice sword. His footwork was precise, his combinations logical, his timing built on long experience reading opponents. Against a normal recruit, or even against a seasoned soldier who hadn't spent years beyond the wall in constant combat, he would have been overwhelming. Jon met the first combination cleanly, stepped the second, and used the third to put himself inside Thorne's guard, close enough that the reach advantage the older man's height gave him was gone, and they were working at infighting distance where everything was wrists and leverage, and the particular education of someone who had fought actual living enemies rather than practice opponents. He didn't end it immediately. That was the decision he'd made. He let it run for 2 minutes, real time, real effort, giving Thorne something honest to work against, and he felt the older man's assessment shifting in real time, felt the moment when Thorne understood that this was not a cocky boy playing at swordplay, but someone who had been through something that had fundamentally altered the shape of his fighting. Jon Snow in his first life had been good. Jon Snow in his second life, with years of actual combat in memory and a body already responsive from years of training rather than starting from nothing, was something noticeably different. He ended it with a bind, locked Thorn's blade, stepped through, put the edge of his sword against the side of the older man's neck and held it there. The yard was silent. Thorn went still. Jon could see the pulse in his throat, the controlled breathing of a man processing something. Jon stepped back and lowered the sword. "Your left combination drops the shoulder early," Jon said, which was the single piece of constructive criticism he had managed to store during the exchange, and which he offered now not to humiliate, but because Thorn was the man responsible for training 20 brothers a year, and it seemed genuinely useful. "Telegraphs the finishing blow." Thorn looked at him. His face was something complicated and unresolved. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "A long life," Jon said, and there was something in his voice that was very close to honest. Thorn held his gaze for another moment, and then, without speaking, he walked back to the far side of the yard. He didn't look back. The recruits along the wall were looking at Jon with varying combinations of awe, apprehension, and the particular expression of people who have just rearranged their understanding of the social hierarchy. Gren had his mouth open slightly. Pip looked like he was composing a story to tell later. Jon set the sword down on the rack and went to bed. 3 days later, Rast made his move. It was nothing special, just a nighttime ambush in the corridor outside the recruits' dormitory. 2 of his friends blocking the narrow passage, Rast in the middle with a length of rope, and the practiced casual menace of someone who had done this before. The target was Samwell Tarly, who had arrived 4 days ago and who was, by any external measure, the worst possible candidate for the night's watch: fat, soft-spoken, openly frightened of almost everything, with the hands of a maester and the bearing of a boy who had been told he was worthless so many times it had become load-bearing architecture in his self-image. Jon had been waiting for this. He'd identified Rast's pattern within a day of the man's arrival, and he'd been watching Sam since the moment Sam had stumbled through the gate looking like a man attending his own execution. He came around the corner behind Rast's group just as the rope was being uncoiled, and he put his hand on Rast's shoulder and turned him around with the efficient ease of someone considerably stronger than they appeared. "No," Jon said simply. Rast's face went through surprise and settled into calculation. His 2 companions were bigger and dumber, the kind of men who operated best with clear instructions. They looked to Rast. "Back off," Rast said. "This isn't your business, Snow. I'm making it my business." Jon was relaxed, his hands loose at his sides, looking at all 3 of them with the calm attention of someone who has already worked out how it goes. "Do you want to do this here, or do you want to think about what happens tomorrow in the yard, and the day after, and every day after that, for the next however many years we're all stuck in this castle together?" "You don't frighten me," Rast said. "Good. I'm not trying to frighten you." He glanced at Sam, who was pressed against the wall with wide eyes, and a face like a man discovering that the world might be stranger and possibly better than previously advertised. "What I am telling you is that if you hurt him, I will make your life here considerably harder than it needs to be, and I will do it in ways that don't get me flogged. I'm creative about things like that." He returned his attention to Rast. "Or you could leave him alone, and we could go back to being simply people stuck at the same miserable castle together. That option's open." Rast held his gaze for a long moment, doing the arithmetic. He was not brave. He was strategic, which was worse in many ways but better in this specific one. He looked at Jon the way he'd been looking at him since the first day, with the careful attention of a man who has decided that a threat is real and is working out how to live with it. "Come on," he said to his companions, and they went. Jon turned to Sam, who was still against the wall and had not yet remembered how to have a normal expression. "You all right?" Yes, I think so." Sam looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Jon leaned against the opposite wall. He looked at the larger boy, the softness of him, the fear, and underneath both, something that his first life had shown him was worth considerably more than muscle or bravado. Samwell Tarly was the man who had discovered how to kill White Walkers with dragonglass through sheer library-based determination. He was the man who had saved Jon's life and the Watch's and eventually half the realm, and he had done it not through any conventional form of valor but through the particular courage of someone who was frightened of absolutely everything and did what needed to be done anyway. "What's your name?" "Samwell Tarly." He said it like he expected the name to do something unfavorable. "My father's Randall Tarly of Horn Hill." "I know who he is," Jon said. "I also know that you know how to read. You've probably read more books than anyone else in this castle, and you've clearly got more going on behind your eyes than you're willing to show anyone." He paused. "The Night's Watch needs fighters, yes, but it also needs people who can think. Trust me on this." Sam looked at him with the expression of someone who had been told a kindness so many times in a tone of contempt that he'd forgotten what it sounded like in earnest. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to be important," Jon said, "and I'd rather you knew it sooner than later." He pushed off the wall and started back toward the dormitory, and after a moment he heard Sam's footsteps fall in behind him, and that was that. Over the following week, something shifted in the dynamic of the recruits that was difficult to put a name to but was visible in the texture of the daily routine. Jon had not attempted to lead or organize anything in any formal sense. He had simply been consistent. He had sparred with each of the recruits personally, adapting to what they needed rather than what was easiest. He had talked to Mormont twice more about the supply situation, about the need for more frequent ranging patrols in the northern reaches to map the movements of the wildling clans, and about the dragonglass. He had spent 2 evenings in the library with Sam, going through the older texts on the long night, and had listened to Sam talk about what he was reading with the particular pleasure of someone who had known this person's mind at its full capacity and was watching it warm up. "This passage here," Sam said one evening, pushing a heavy tome across the table. "The last Lord Commander who fought the others, he describes the cold, not just the temperature. He says the cold moved like it was deliberate, like it was them." Sam looked at Jon with the careful look he was starting to use, the one that said he had noticed that Jon already knew things he shouldn't. "You already knew that." "I suspected it," Jon said. "You know more than you're saying." Yes, Sam considered this. He was better at it than most, accepting partial truths and working with them rather than demanding the whole picture. "Is it bad, what you know?" "It's very bad," Jon said. "But it's manageable, if we're smart and if we move quickly enough." Sam repeated, and something in his tone said he had decided right then that he was included in that word and was going to hold it. In the second week, Jon cornered Thorn after an afternoon session. Thorn saw him coming and turned to face him, which Jon gave him credit for. Some men in Thorn's position would have walked away from the conversation. "What is it, Snow?" "The recruits need more time on the wall itself, not just yard work." Jon had thought about how to frame this carefully. "They need to understand what they're actually defending. Most of them have never been more than a mile from it. If they go up there now, early, it becomes part of their understanding of the work. Not just training, but the reason for the training." Thorn looked at him. "You don't give instructions here." "I'm not. I'm making a request based on what I've observed." Jon kept his tone level without pushback or pressure. "You're the master-at-arms. It's your call entirely. I just think it would help." Thorn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why do you care so much? You've been here 2 weeks. Most recruits spend the first month figuring out how to get enough food." Jon had thought about this question, about what to say when it came. "Because the alternative is caring too little," he said, "and I've seen where that leads." Thorn looked at him with the look he'd been developing over the past 2 weeks, the one that had started as contempt and was now something more considered and less comfortable. He was not a man who liked having to revise his initial assessments, but he was, underneath the cruelty and the rigidity, someone who had originally joined the Watch because he believed in its purpose. That belief had been compressed and deformed by long years of inadequate resources and incompetent leadership, and the general institutional rot of an organization that the realm had forgotten about. But it was still there. Jon could see it. "I'll consider it," Thorne said and walked away. He ordered the wall visit for the following morning. Jon stood on the elevator with the other recruits as it ground upward, and he watched their faces change as the height accumulated, the way the ground fell away and the world opened up, both south and north, and the scale of the thing they'd volunteered for became suddenly and violently real. Gren gripped the cage rail with white knuckles. Pip had gone pale. Sam had his eyes closed for the first 300 feet, and then when he opened them and looked north, became very still in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Gods," Sam said quietly. "Yes," Jon said. "You've been up here before." It wasn't quite a question. Jon looked north over the dark roll of the haunted forest and the gray open distance beyond, and he said, "It gets easier to look at, and harder." Sam considered this. "How long before they come?" Jon turned to look at him. Sam was looking north too, his face serious and unsentimental, processing the landscape with the methodical clarity of someone counting and measuring, and not pretending the numbers came out well. "Years yet," Jon said, "but years go faster than people expect. Then we need to use them." "Yes," Jon said, "we do." The conspiracy began taking shape, as it always did, around the edges of things. Jon noticed it as a change in temperature, the way certain conversations stopped when he entered a room, the way Thorne watched him now with an expression that had graduated from calculation to something harder to identify. He knew who the architects were. He knew the trajectory. In his first life, he had not seen it coming because he had been trusting by nature, and because he had assumed that shared purpose was sufficient bond. He did not make that assumption this time. One evening he found himself in Mormont's solar again, the Raven asleep on its perch, the Lord Commander reading dispatches from the southern chapters of the Watch, with the air of a man reading his own obituary. Jon sat when offered and looked at the older man and made a decision. "My lord," he said, "there are men in this castle who are going to decide eventually that I'm a danger to the Watch. I want you to know that in advance." Mormont set down the dispatch. His pale eyes were very direct. "Why would they think that?" "Because I'm asking questions they don't like. Because I'm building relationships they find unsettling. Because I'm competent in ways that threaten people who need to feel superior." He paused. "And possibly because I know things I shouldn't know, and some of them can feel it. What do you want me to do about it?" "Nothing yet. I just want you to remember this conversation when the time comes." Jon met the Lord Commander's gaze steadily. "I'm not going anywhere, my lord. I'm not here for rank or glory or because I had nowhere else to go. I'm here because this is where the war actually starts, and I intend to be useful to it in every way I can. But I want at least one person in authority to know that before the politics start." Mormont was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. The Raven shifted on its perch and muttered something that might have been traitor or might have been breakfast. "You're a strange boy," Mormont said again. "Different from when you arrived somehow, like something settling." "Something did settle," Jon said. "Sir." "These men who think you're dangerous," Mormont said carefully. "Are they wrong?" Jon thought about this honestly. He thought about the wall and the dead and the things he'd already set in motion and the things he intended to set in motion. He thought about the name he carried, the blood in his veins, the knowledge in his head. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of dangerous that kept people alive versus the kind that got them killed. "To the Watch's enemies," Jon said, "very much so. To everyone else, I hope not." Mormont held his gaze for another moment, and then he picked up his dispatch and went back to reading. "Dismissed, Snow." Jon left. That night he lay on his bunk in the darkness with Ghost warm against his leg, and he thought about everything and nothing and the long road ahead of him. He thought about the wall at his back and the darkness ahead of it and the political machinery grinding south in King's Landing without his father to interrupt it. And he thought, I haven't changed enough yet. I need to be faster. I need to be further ahead of all of this than I am. The Night's Watch went about its ancient nocturnal business around him. The distant stamp of boots on the wall, the grunt of the watch change, the wind off the north doing what it always did, carrying the cold and the patience of something vast. Jon Snow stared at the ceiling and began working through the next phase. He had recruits to finish forging. He had a Lord Commander to fully convince. He had supply lines to think about and dragonglass to locate, and a king beyond the wall who needed to be spoken to before the Watch decided to go to war with him unnecessarily. And somewhere, deep in the political wreckage of King's Landing, his father was trying not to die for the second time, and Jon could only hope the old man had listened, and that honesty would be enough, and that some things with sufficient foreknowledge and sufficient love could be made to go differently. He thought it probably could. He also thought it was going to be a very long road to that particular kind of different. Ghost's ear flicked. The wind shifted. Somewhere on the wall, a ranger called the all clear. Jon Snow closed his eyes and slept the sleep of a man with too much to do and just enough time to do it, and in the morning he would begin again. Chapter 3. The king beyond the wall. The ranging party left Castle Black on a morning so cold the horses breathed clouds that hung in the air long after they'd passed, like the world was keeping a record of everywhere they'd been. Jon had spent 3 weeks engineering this, not the ranging itself. Mormont had been planning a scouting expedition beyond the wall for months, the usual sweep of the haunted forests near reaches, standard patrol business. What Jon had engineered was his own inclusion in it, and the specific route it would take, and the quiet addition of 3 supply packs loaded with dragonglass blades wrapped in oilskin that he and Donal Noy had spent 4 evenings napping from the castle's small reserve. Noy had not asked too many questions. He was that kind of man. The party was 8 strong, 3 rangers, Jon, 2 other recruits who had advanced quickly enough to be deemed useful, and 2 stewards handling supply. The ranger in command was a weathered man named Jeremy Ricker, who had the particular quality of someone who had been beyond the wall enough times that it had burned the fear out of him, and replaced it with a very precise and functional caution. He briefed them in the yard before departure with minimal words and maximum usefulness, and Jon liked him immediately. "Stay on my left," Ricker told Jon as they mounted. "Yes, sir." "I've been told you know things," Ricker said without particular inflection. He was checking his horse's girth strap and not looking at Jon. "Mormont mentioned you, said you had instincts. I try to pay attention. Good instinct to have," Ricker mounted. "If your instincts tell you something beyond the wall, you tell me immediately. You don't act on it yourself. You don't discuss it with the other recruits. You tell me." "Understood," Jon said, and he meant it. He had not come on this ranging to be a hero. He had come because there were things beyond the wall he needed to see with his own eyes in this timeline, to understand what was already moving and how fast. The gate opened and they rode through, and the wall was above them and then behind them, and the haunted forest swallowed them whole. There was nothing that felt like beyond the wall. It was its own country, its own quality of air and silence, the trees older and darker, the light different, filtered through canopy in a way that made everything feel slightly sideways from the world south of the wall. The sounds were different. The absence of certain sounds was different. Jon rode with his eyes moving and Ghost padding alongside him. The direwolf grown enough now to reach Jon's knee, moving through the underbrush with the liquid silence of something that belonged here in a way that the horses very clearly did not. He was watching for specific things. In his first life, the great ranging had swept northeast and found nothing but cold and silence until it found everything at once. The massacre at the Fist of First Men, the dead rising, the catastrophic collapse of 200 men into chaos. He had survived it barely and at enormous cost. He was not going to let it happen that way again. What he needed to know was the timeline. How far had the Night King's forces moved? Were the Whites already ranging this close to the wall, or was there still buffer? He needed to see the evidence with his own eyes rather than relying purely on memory, because memory from a different timeline was a guide, not a map. On the second day they found the first sign. It was a campsite, wildling, recent, maybe 2 days old. Jon knew it was a wildling camp and not a ranger camp because of how it was built, the particular way free folk positioned their fires relative to wind and tree cover, the different refuse patterns. But what interested him was the direction it had been abandoned in. South. The camp was moving south and quickly, without the leisurely pace of a clan that was wandering. "They're running," Jon said. Ricker crouched over the cold fire pit and looked at the ash. "Running or relocating?" "Running. Look at the pace of departure. They left something here." Jon moved to the eastern edge of the camp where the underbrush had been pressed down in a hurry and found a cooking pot. Heavy iron. You didn't leave a cooking pot behind because you wanted to. They left in a hurry and they went south. People who are relocating by choice don't leave their iron. Ricker stood and looked at him. "They're being pushed," Jon said. "Something north of here is moving and they're getting out of its way. The Watch's ranging party. Number we haven't been this far north in months. Something else." He looked north through the trees, the darkness between trunks that went on, and eventually became something colder than geography. "We should mark this location and head north another half-day. I want to see if there are more camps." "I give the orders on this ranging," Ricker said, not unkindly. "Yes, sir, I'm recommending." Ricker looked north, then at Jon, then north again. He was the kind of man who could hear sense regardless of its source. "Half a day," he said. "Then we turn back." There were 2 more camps in the following half-day, both abandoned south. In the third one they found something that made even the experienced rangers go quiet. A kill, too large for a wolf, marks in the frozen ground that didn't correspond to any animal track Ricker had seen in 30 years of ranging, and a cold that was sharper than the ambient temperature should have explained, centered on a particular patch of ground near the northern tree line, as if something had stood there and had not been warm. "We're leaving," Ricker said. "Yes," Jon agreed immediately. He had seen what he came to see. They rode south hard for 2 hours before Ricker slowed them to a sustainable pace, and for those 2 hours nobody said much of anything, because the forest had a quality to it now that made speech feel inadvisable. Ghost ran alongside Jon's horse and his hackles were up the entire way, and Jon rode with a dragonglass blade loose in his belt and watched the trees and was very glad when the wall appeared ahead of them through the canopy. Back in Castle Black, he went directly to Mormont. The Lord Commander listened to Ricker's report and Jon's supplementary account without interruption. When they finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The Fist of First Men." "My lord," Ricker said, "there's a hill, 2 days northeast of here, old ringfort on top, good defensive position. The free folk know it, we've used it for ranging camps before." Mormont turned to his maps. "If something is pushing the wildlings south on a broad front, the Fist is where our ranging parties will collide with whatever is doing the pushing." "Then we shouldn't send a ranging party to the Fist," Jon said. Both men looked at him. "Not a traditional one," Jon continued, and moved to the map. He was careful about how much he appeared to know, about the line between usefully informative and inexplicably prescient. "If the wildlings are moving south in numbers, they'll consolidate somewhere. They don't have the organizational capacity to move as a unified force without a leader. Mance Rayder, the deserter, Mormont said. He's their king now, has been for years. Jon kept his voice neutral. He's gathering them. He's been doing it slowly, but whatever is happening north of the Fist is accelerating his timeline. He looked at the map. If we send 200 men to the Fist, we put 200 men in the path of the wildling consolidation and whatever is behind it. And the Fist is not a position you can hold against what's behind it. Mormont's voice was very quiet. And what is behind it? Jon met his eyes. The same thing that built the wall. The silence lasted a long time. Ricker was looking at Jon with the expression of a man who had been suspicious of something for 30 years and had just had it confirmed by someone who shouldn't have been able to confirm it. You said you know things, Ricker said slowly. Back in the yard, I thought Mormont meant tactical instinct. He meant tactical instinct, Jon said. My tactical instinct says we don't put 200 men in a hole they can't get out of. Then what do you suggest? Mormont said. Jon straightened. I suggest we talk to Mance Rayder before we march against him. Ricker actually laughed, short and sharp. He's a deserter. We don't negotiate with deserters. He's a man who got beyond the wall and learned something we need to know and came back to do something about it. Jon looked at Mormont. He's not gathering the wildlings to invade. He's gathering them to run. Because whatever is behind the Fist of First Men terrifies even the people who have lived with it as a story their whole lives. He paused. We could fight our way through both armies and accomplish nothing except getting the Watch killed. Or we could talk to the man who knows this enemy better than anyone south of the wall, and use that knowledge. Or suggesting we allow 100,000 wildlings through the wall, Mormont said flatly. I'm suggesting that 100,000 living people are more useful than the same 100,000 dead ones walking south under someone else's direction. He held the Lord Commander's gaze. Think about what the wall is actually for, my lord. It was never meant to keep people out. It was meant to keep the dead out. If the living need to be on this side of it, there's no law in the world worth more than that fact. Mormont looked at him for a very long time. Then he looked at his map. Then he looked back at Jon. I cannot authorize a wildling through the wall, he said. Not today. Not without the support of the commanders and not without understanding what we're actually dealing with. He raised a hand before Jon could respond. But I can authorize an intelligence-gathering mission. A small party beyond the wall with specific purpose of assessing the scale of wildling consolidation and the nature of the threat pushing them south. And if that mission happened to come into contact with Mance Rayder's people, Ricker said very carefully, then the party would gather whatever intelligence was available, Mormont said. Jon looked at the Lord Commander, at the intelligence in those pale eyes, the careful navigation of a man who understood that there were things the Watch's rules didn't account for and that the rules had been written a long time ago and the world had changed. When? Jon said. 2 weeks, Mormont said. Give me time to organize it properly, and Snow, you don't go alone. I'll take Gren and Pip, Jon said. And Sam. Ricker raised an eyebrow. The fat boy. He reads, Jon said. And he notices things people miss. He's exactly who you want in an intelligence-gathering operation. He told them that evening, after dinner, in the corner of the common hall where they'd fallen into the habit of gathering. The 4 of them, unlikely by any ordinary measure. But Jon had learned in his first life that the usual measures of military usefulness were about 30% accurate at best. Gren received the information with the careful solemnity of a man who had decided to trust Jon's judgment and was going to follow it even when it was alarming. Pip, predictably, wanted details. What were they likely to find? How big was Mance's army? Would there be actual fighting? And Jon answered what he could and left the rest deliberately vague. Sam turned slightly pale and then got very quiet in the way he did when he was processing something enormous. Beyond the wall, Sam said, voluntarily, Yes. I've only been here 6 weeks. I know. I can barely get through sparring practice without losing my breakfast. Sam, Jon said, do you trust me? Sam looked at him. It was the look that Sam Tarly had given him a dozen times in their first life. The one that meant, I know this is insane, and I'm going to do it anyway because of you, which I'd resent if I wasn't also fully invested. Regrettably, yes, Sam said. Good. You're not coming for the fighting. You're coming because I need someone who can take in a lot of information quickly and remember it precisely, and that's you. Sam's chin went up slightly. It was a small thing, but Jon caught it, the way a person looks when they've been told something true about themselves that they hadn't let themselves believe yet. I'll need better boots, Sam said practically. The ones I have are terrible. I'll get you better boots. And a warmer cloak. The one they gave me is, Sam. Right, yes, I'll go. The 2 weeks passed in the way that purposeful time passes, quickly, with the particular density of days that have work in them. Jon continued the training with Thorne's recruits, and the shape of the group had changed enough by now that even Thorne seemed to notice. They were tighter, less frightened, moving with more purpose in the yard. Gren had become genuinely competent in a way that his first life had taken considerably longer to achieve. Pip had found his feet and his speed, and was developing into the kind of lightsaber fighter who could beat men twice his size if he stayed moving. Thorne watched all of this from his usual position of apparent contempt and said nothing, which Jon was beginning to understand was Thorne's version of approval. There was a raven from Winterfell in the first week. Jon's hands were steady when he opened it because he told himself they would be. The king arrived. The offer was made. Father accepted. We leave for King's Landing in a fortnight. I have done what you asked, spoken to Robb. He gave his word on Winterfell. Arya is unmanageable but alive. I have not forgotten what you told me about Littlefinger. Be careful beyond the wall. N.S. Jon read it twice, committed it to memory, and burned it. The burning was practical, not emotional. Probably. He wrote back, trust Varys over Baelish. Find the proof about the lions and send copies to 3 people simultaneously so no one copy can be suppressed. Don't ride alone. J.S. On the morning of the ranging, the 4 of them assembled at the gate in the gray pre-dawn, geared for a week in the cold beyond the wall. Rickard was coming too, and 2 experienced rangers Jon trusted, experienced in the specific sense that they were the kind of men who had a healthy relationship with their own fear rather than being controlled by it. Mormont came to see them off, which was not standard. He stood in the yard in the cold without a cloak, which was very much a performance of indifference to the temperature that only old soldiers attempted, and he looked at Jon with the look he'd been developing over the past weeks, something between assessment and something that a man like Mormont would never use the word regard for, but which functioned roughly the same. Don't do anything I can't explain to the other commanders, Mormont said. I'll do my best, Jon said. That's what concerns me, Mormont said and went back inside. They found Mance Raider's outriders on the 3rd day. This was not accidental. Jon had guided the ranging northeast on the logic that Mance would consolidate along the Milkwater River Valley. Good water, defensible terrain, central enough to receive clans from multiple directions. He had not said this directly to Rickard, because the explanation for how he knew it was not available to him. But he had made the case in terms of wildling tactical patterns and clan movement history, and Rickard had agreed because the argument was sound regardless of its source. The outriders were 3 men on shaggy northern horses, armed with composite bows and short spears, and they materialized out of the tree line with the particular unhurried efficiency of people who had been watching the ranging party for considerably longer than the ranging party had been watching them. Rickard's hand went to his sword. Don't, Jon said quietly. Snow, they had a clean shot at us for the last hour. 3 arrows, 3 targets done. They chose not to. He kept his hands visible and still. They want to talk. He turned his horse to face the outriders directly and held their gaze and waited. The lead outrider was a woman older, with a face like weathered stone and eyes that had the particular quality of someone who had seen winters that men south of the wall only read about in old books. She looked at the ranging party with steady assessment, and her assessment landed on Jon and stayed there. "Crow," she said. It was not an insult. It was a category. "Yes," Jon said. "We're not here to fight. We need to speak with Mance Rayder." "Mance Rayder doesn't speak with crows." "He will with this one," Jon said. "Tell him a crow wants to talk about what's north of the Fist of First Men. Tell him I know what he knows. He'll decide." The outrider looked at him for a long moment. Then she and her companions withdrew into the tree line without another word. Rickard kept his sword hand loose for the next hour. Nothing came at them from the trees, which Jon had been confident about but was still quietly relieved to have confirmed. The response came at dusk. A different rider, younger, with Mance's banner if the free folk had such things, which they didn't, but carrying the particular authority of a formal escort, which amounted to the same thing. "He'll see you," the rider said. "One man." Jon dismounted. Rickard grabbed his arm. "You're not going alone into their camp." "I am," Jon said pleasantly, "because 2 or 3 of us going in looks like a delegation with conditions, and that tells him we're negotiating from weakness. 1 man walking in alone tells him we're either confident or crazy, and either way it's worth talking to us." He looked at Rickard steadily. "Wait here. I'll be back before morning." Rickard looked at him with the expression he'd been developing since the abandoned camps, the one that had resolved from suspicion into something more like the unwilling trust you give to someone whose predictions keep coming true. He let go of Jon's arm. Jon followed the rider into the dark. Mance Rayder's camp was enormous, even at this stage of the consolidation. The fires went on further than Jon could easily count in the dark, spread through the trees in the careful pattern of someone who understood that mass fires visible from the wall were a tactical mistake. The sounds of it were complex, the particular multilingual chaos of dozens of clans whose languages shared roots but had diverged over centuries, children calling to each other in dialects that had no words borrowed from the south, the smell of meat cooking over fires, and the smell of too many people in a cold space and underneath both, the particular smell of fear that was not cowardice, but the reasonable response of people who understood exactly what was behind them. He was brought to a tent that was larger than the others without being ostentatious about it. The fire inside was well built, the heat efficient. A man sat on a folded blanket by the fire with a cup of something, reading, which was itself enough to tell you something about Mance Rayder from a small book with a cracked spine. He looked up when Jon entered. Jon had thought about what he remembered of Mance Rayder and whether memory was adequate preparation. It was not. The man was in his 50s, with the kind of physical economy that came from a life spent in cold and motion. A face that had been interesting before weather had worked on it and was more interesting after. His eyes were intelligent and measuring, and had the quality of someone who was almost never surprised but was prepared to be when it was warranted. He looked at Jon for a moment and then went back to his book. "Sit down, Crow. You're letting the cold in." Jon sat. Ghost had come with him, which the escort had not been able to prevent, and Ghost sat between Jon and the fire and looked at Mance with the red-eyed assessment of a creature forming an opinion. "Nice wolf," Mance said. "He is," Jon agreed. "The outrider said you know what's north of the Fist." Mance set down his book. He looked at Jon fully now, the assessment unhurried and complete. "Let's hear it." "The dead are moving," Jon said. "Not as an unorganized force. Something is leading them. Something that was here before the wall was built and has been waiting on the other side of it for 8,000 years. He paused. "You've seen them. Not just heard stories, seen them personally, close enough to know that dragon steel and dragon glass are the only things that stop them and ordinary steel is worthless." Mance was very still. I also know, Jon continued, that you've been gathering the free folk not to attack the wall but to get through it, because you understand that whatever is coming is going to swallow everyone north of the wall and then go south, and the only hope is to be on the other side of it when it starts. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a child laughed at something. Who told you all this? Mance said. It was not quite a question. Nobody, I worked it out. From what evidence? Abandoned camps running south. A kill site with the wrong cold around it. The pattern of wildling movement over the last 2 years. Jon met his gaze. And the fact that the Night's Watch is the only military force south of the wall that takes any of this seriously. And there are only 900 of us, and we are in desperate need of allies. You're proposing an alliance, Mance said slowly. I'm proposing a conversation about one. The Watch won't allow wildlings through the wall. Your Lord Commander's hands are tied by 600 years of institutional reflex. My Lord Commander, Jon said carefully, is a more practical man than the institution he represents. The institution will need persuasion. That takes time and politics and a demonstration of common interest. He looked at Mance steadily. But it starts here, with this conversation, with you and me agreeing that the actual enemy is not each other. Mance picked up his cup and looked into it for a moment. You're not like other crows, he said. I've been told. How old are you? Old enough, Jon said, which was the honest answer. Mance stood and moved to the tent entrance, looked out at his camp, the fires, the moving shapes, the vast temporary city of people who had been pushed from their homes by something they couldn't fight. When he turned back, something had shifted in his face. The wariness was still there, but something behind it had decided. I'll tell you what's north of the fist, he said. All of it. What I've seen and what I know and what I think is coming. He looked at Jon. And you'll tell your Lord Commander, and we'll see if sense can be made to happen before it's too late for sense to matter. That's all I'm asking, Jon said. Mance talked for 2 hours. Jon listened with the absolute focused attention of a man who already knew most of what he was being told and was searching carefully for the pieces he didn't, the gaps in his own knowledge. The things that had happened between the Night King's first movements and the Battle of Winterfell that he had never fully understood. There were pieces, significant ones. The Night King was not simply moving south. He was doing something more deliberate, collecting in specific locations the bodies of the dead with intention, building his army with strategic patience rather than simple opportunistic numbers. He had been doing this for decades slowly, and the pace was accelerating. He wants something specific, Jon said when Mance paused. What do you mean? He's not just building numbers. He wants something in particular that's south of the wall, something he's been building toward. Jon thought about this, thought about what he knew of the Night King from his first life, the things that had never quite been explained, the sense of purpose behind the dead man's movements that had felt like more than simply conquest. Something at Winterfell, maybe, or King's Landing, something old. Like what? Jon didn't answer because he didn't know, and saying that out loud was more useful than pretending. When Jon left the camp before dawn, Mance walked him to the edge of it. They stood in the gray pre-morning between the firelight and the forest, and Mance looked at him with the expression of a man completing an assessment. I'm going to tell you something, Mance said, in the interest of this conversation. Go ahead. There's a girl with your ranging party. I mean a woman, a spearwife young, was taken by a ranging party 2 years ago, and I got her back, but she's been north of your wall and south of your wall and north again, and she knows both worlds. Her name is Ygritte. He studied Jon's reaction with those intelligent eyes. I'm sending her as a liaison, something to show good faith. She's the best scout I have, and she speaks the crow tongue properly, and she doesn't frighten easily. Jon kept his face still. He said, I appreciate that. Mance looked at him for a moment longer. She'll drive you completely insane, he said, and there was something almost like warmth in it, the affection of a man for a difficult and valued person. She's honest to the point of being dangerous. Try not to hold it against her." Jon thought about red hair in firelight, and a voice that cut like the cold, and a small body lying still on a battlefield with an arrow in her, and the particular agony of holding something you can't hold together. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. He walked back to Rickard and the others through the pre-dawn forest, Ghost at his heel, and he looked at the sky going pale above the tree line and thought about timelines and second chances, and the particular weight of knowing what a person means to you before you've even properly met them. Rickard looked up when Jon came back into camp. He looked at Jon's face and then past him at the darkness of the forest. "Well," he said. "We have a channel," Jon said. "It's not an alliance yet, but it's the beginning of one. And we're getting a liaison." He started to unsaddle his horse. "We need to be back at Castle Black in 3 days. And the threat," Rickard said, "north of the Fist, is it as bad as—" "Worse," Jon said, simply and without drama. "It's worse than whatever you were imagining." Rickard was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded with the sharp, decisive nod of a man filing something under confirmed and adjusting accordingly. "We ride at first light." Sam appeared at Jon's elbow with a cup of something warm and the particular expression of someone who had been awake all night thinking and had arrived at the end of a long internal argument. "You met him," Sam said. "Mance Rayder, yes, what's he like?" Jon thought about the man with the cracked book and the fire built with efficiency and the way he'd looked out at his people with the weight of them all visible in his shoulders. "Smarter than the Watch wants him to be," Jon said, "and braver than he lets on. Do you think he'll help?" "I think he already is," Jon said. "He just needs us to be worth helping." He drank the warm thing Sam handed him. It was tea, roughly, or something that aspired to be tea with insufficient ingredients, and looked east where the sky was starting its reluctant gray brightening over the top of the wall. Somewhere in Mance's camp, a woman with red hair and a spearwife's blade was being told she was going south. Jon wondered what her face looked like when she heard it. He suspected it looked like a person being told something they hadn't asked for and intended to make entirely their own. The wall caught the first light and held it, enormous and white and old, and Jon looked at it and thought, "Not yet. But it's starting. Everything is starting." Ghost put his chin on Jon's knee and looked up at him with red eyes that caught the new light. "I know," Jon told him. He finished his tea and went awake the others. Chapter 4. What the Fire Remembers. She arrived on a Tuesday, which was not a day that meant anything beyond the wall but which Jon had been marking on his private calendar, with the specific dread of someone who knows a thing is coming, and cannot decide whether to prepare for it, or simply let it happen. Ygritte came through the gate at Castle Black like she owned the road she traveled to get there. Alone, on a shaggy northern pony that looked like it had been assembled from leftover parts, with a bone-handled knife at each hip and a short recurve bow across her back and red hair, that the wind was doing something magnificent and probably unintentional with. She looked at the castle walls with the expression of someone taking inventory of a place they expected to need to leave quickly. Jon was in the yard when she arrived. He had not arranged to be in the yard. He had simply been there, sparring with Gren, and she had ridden through the gate, and then the sparring had stopped. She spotted him because Ghost spotted her first. The direwolf had gone from lying in the shade to standing alert in the time it took to blink, not with hostility, but with the focused attention of a creature recognizing something significant, which was its own kind of commentary. Ygritte's pony shied from Ghost, and she brought it back under control with her knees without breaking eye contact with the wolf. Then she looked up and found Jon looking at her. "You're the crow," she said, not a question. "One of them," Jon said, "the one who talked to Mance." She looked him over in the same way she'd looked at the castle walls, inventory, assessment, categorization. Her eyes were sharp and brown and entirely unimpressed. "You're younger than I thought." "You're what I expected," Jon said, and immediately knew from the look on her face that he'd chosen the wrong phrasing. "Is that right?" she said, in a tone that could have stripped paint. "I meant Mance described you. I had a picture." He was aware that Gren was watching this exchange with the polite fascination of someone at a tournament trying not to show they're enjoying it. "I'm Jon Snow. Welcome to Castle Black. Ygritte of the Harlaw clan," she said, with the particular flatness of someone whose name was their full biography. She dismounted without being invited to, which told him she had already decided she was staying whether or not anyone wanted her to, and handed her pony's reins to the nearest person, who happened to be a steward who had not been expecting to receive them. "This castle is falling apart," she added, looking around. "Our mortar is crumbling in 6 places I can see from here. The gate mechanism is rusted. Your wall guard does the same patrol pattern every hour on the hour." "We're understaffed," Jon said. "You're undisciplined," she corrected. "Different problem, different solution." Jon looked at her. She looked back at him. The wind moved her hair again. "I'll show you where you're staying," he said. "I'll find it myself." She picked up her pack from the pony's flank. "I need to speak with your Lord Commander." Mance sent a message. She produced a sealed letter from inside her jacket, properly sealed with wax, which was a statement about Mance's organizational range that Jon filed away. "Probably shouldn't go through you. Mormont Solar is the tower there," Jon said, pointing. "3rd floor, knock first. He has a raven that bites." She looked at the tower and then at Jon and then walked away without another word, and Jon turned back to Gren, who was making a very specific kind of face. "What?" Jon said. "Nothing," Gren said with the enormous innocence of a man saying the opposite. "She seems nice." Jon picked up his practice sword. "Again," he said. She was given quarters in the steward's wing, the same wing as the other recruits and junior members, and she treated the room with the practical efficiency of someone who had never owned more space than she needed and wasn't going to start being sentimental about it. Jon knew this because he walked past her open door 20 minutes after showing her the tower and she was already unpacked. The word was perhaps too grand, since she appeared to own roughly 4 things and 2 of them were knives, and sitting cross-legged on the bed, refletching an arrow with the focused economy of someone doing maintenance rather than killing time. She looked up when he passed. "You walked past slowly," she said, without looking up from the arrow. "Why?" "I didn't." "You did. You were curious whether I'd already left." Jon stopped in the doorway. "Would you have?" She set down the arrow and looked at him properly, the full inventory assessment again, more thorough this time. "Mance said you were strange," she said. "He said it the way he says things he means." "What did you tell him?" "I told him crows are all the same." She picked up the arrow again. "I was probably wrong." "Almost definitely," Jon said. She looked up sharply, not because she was offended but because she had not expected the confidence in it, the easy lack of defensiveness. Jon had learned in his first life that the wrong way to talk to Ygritte was carefully. She respected directness the way a good blade respected a whetstone. It was what sharpened her. "Why'd you go to Mance alone?" she said. "You could have been killed. Anyone else would have sent a message." "Sending a message says you're not sure how it'll be received. Going yourself says you're committed to the outcome. Or it says you're an idiot. Sometimes both." She almost smiled. It was quick, gone before it could be catalogued. But Jon had been watching for it and caught it. In his first life, her smiles had always been like that at first, arrived without warning and departed at speed, like they were surprised to find themselves there. "Mormont's meeting with me tomorrow," she said. "He wants to talk about the threat assessment before he'll consider Mance's proposal. He says he needs to hear it from someone who's been north of the fist." "What did Mance propose?" She looked at him. "I thought you were the one who started this negotiation." "I started a conversation." "Mance will have taken it further. He's asking for passage rights, staged movement, controlled entry points, the watch supervising the crossing, not flooding through structured." She said this with the slight flatness of someone repeating a position she'd had to memorize and has opinions about. He also says that if the Watch cooperates, every free man and woman who comes south will be available to fight when the time comes, not as crows, as themselves, under their own leadership. And you think that's a good offer? I think it's the only offer that keeps your Watch relevant, she said bluntly. Because the alternative is Mance's people trying to force the wall, the Watch fighting them, everyone bleeding out, and then what's behind us walks through while you're all busy dying for nothing. Jon looked at her. She held his gaze with the frank, challenging steadiness that had always been one of the most remarkable things about her, the total absence of performance, the complete unwillingness to position herself for comfort. "Tell Mormont exactly what you just told me," Jon said. In those words, he responds to directness. "Does he?" she said skeptically. "He's not your enemy. None of us are your enemy." Jon paused in the doorway. "I know that's harder to believe here than anywhere, but it's true." She looked at him for a moment longer with that assessing quality. "You knew my name before I gave it," she said. "Mance told you, you said, but you said it before I introduced myself. When you said I was what you expected." Jon was still. "I notice things," she said simply, not accusatory, just informational, the way she would note the direction of the wind or the state of the gate mechanism. "I should have been more careful," Jon said. "Probably." She went back to the arrow. "Don't be, though. It's more interesting when you're not." He went to bed that night with the specific low-grade agony of a man who had loved someone and watched them die, and was now in the process of meeting them for the first time, all overlaid on each other in a way that had no clean emotional resolution. He was not going to tell her. He was not going to let what he knew of where they ended up drive how this went. He was going to let it be what it was, whatever that turned out to be in this life, and do the only thing he could do, which was to make sure this time there was something worth arriving at. Ghost lay on his feet and dreamed something that made his paws move. Ygritte's meeting with Mormont lasted 3 hours. Jon was not present, which was the right call and which he had made deliberately. Being in the room would have positioned him as an intermediary, which was not what this needed to be. He wanted Mormont to hear the threat from someone who was not Jon Snow, to have his own experience of Ygritte's directness and the quality of her information, to arrive at his own conclusions without Jon's influence as the primary filter. He spent those 3 hours doing something that had been demanding his attention for the better part of a week, going through the night's watches supply records with Donal Noy, and trying to work out exactly how badly under-resourced the dragonglass situation actually was. The answer was badly. Castle Black stores held roughly 300 dragonglass blades, give or take, most of them old and some of them poorly knapped, the edges dulled or irregular, the points uneven. There were perhaps another 100 at Eastwatch and a comparable number at the Shadow Tower. Total defensive capacity against an enemy that steel could not touch. Approximately 500 weapons for a force of 900, not all of whom were fighters, spread across 3 castles and 2,000 miles of wall. "Dragonstone," Noy said. He said it the way he said everything, with the economy of a man who had already thought it through and was handing over the conclusion rather than the working. "How much is there?" "Old records say the whole island's volcanic. The caves under the castle are half obsidian." Noy looked at the inventory. "Enough for 10 armies, maybe, if the records are accurate." "They are," Jon said, and Noy looked at him sidelong but didn't ask. "Getting to Dragonstone is the problem. It's a crown property, empty now but politically sensitive. You'd need the crown's permission. Or a very good argument for why asking permission is less important than being ready." Jon thought about this. Dragonstone in his first life had been Daenerys's seat. She'd arrived there eventually, claimed it as her ancestral home, and Jon had gone to her asking for just this thing, the dragonglass under the castle. It had worked. But that timeline was years away, and he didn't have years to wait for the right political moment to access a natural resource that the realm needed now. "Right to the Meister's citadel," he said to Noy. "Not to the king. The citadel has records on Dragonstone's composition, on the historical use of dragonglass in the long night. If we can get the citadel's acknowledgement that the threat is real and the resource is strategic, that's the foundation for a legal case to access the stores." He paused. "And I'll write to someone at Dragonstone directly." Noy raised an eyebrow. "There's a caretaker garrison," Jon said. "Small, but they'd respond to a formal request from a Night's Watch officer." "You're a recruit," Noy pointed out. "Technically, but Mormont will sign the letter if I draft it properly." He looked at the inventory. "Start on the stores we have. Regrind the dull ones. I'll show you the proper napping method. There's a technique for maintaining the edge that's faster than starting from scratch." "Where did you learn to nap obsidian?" Noy said. "Long life," Jon said, and Noy's mouth moved in what might have been a smile. Ygritte found him in the armory that evening, bent over a stone with a dragonglass blade and an antler-tip pressure flaker, working the edge back into shape with the careful rhythm of someone doing something that required more attention than strength. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before she spoke. "You know how to do that," she said. "Yes." "Where does a crow learn to nap?" "I grew up north of the wall in a previous life," Jon said, without looking up, and felt her sharp attention fix on the side of his face. She came into the armory and sat on the bench across from him and watched what he was doing with the frank professional interest of someone whose people had used this craft for generations. After a moment she said, "Your angle on the platform is wrong. You're wasting material." He adjusted the angle. The flake came off cleaner. "There," she said. They worked in silence for a while, him on the blade, her watching and occasionally making a correction, the fire in the corner making the only sound. It was comfortable in the way that shared work is comfortable. The kind of ease that has nothing to do with how long you've known someone, and everything to do with whether you fit in the same space. "Mormont will do it," she said eventually. "The passage writes. Not immediately. He says he needs to build support among the other commanders first, and he needs to make the case to the crown at some point, but yes, he'll do it." She paused. "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "A crow," she said. The word had a specific meaning when she used it, not the watch in the functional sense but the institutional rot of it, the small-minded fear and the habitual cruelty toward her people. "He's something else. He's a man who actually cares about what the wall is for," Jon said, "not just what it symbolizes." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Why are you doing this?" "Making dragonglass blades. All of it. The ranging, the negotiation with Mance, the supply audit, She gestured around the armory, the evidence of his accumulated weeks of preparation. "You've been here 6 weeks. Most crows spend the first 6 weeks learning not to cry themselves to sleep." Jon set down the blade and looked at her. In the firelight her hair was exactly the red-orange of a coal just beginning to catch, and the familiar pain of knowing moved through him and was gone, because there was no useful thing he could do with it. "Because no one else is," he said. "And someone has to." She held his gaze with the searching quality she applied to everything, the fundamental unwillingness to accept the surface of things. "You're not afraid," she said. "You're really not afraid. Not of Mance, not of what's north of the Fist, not of Thorn or Mormont or any of it." She tilted her head slightly. "What does a man have to see to run out of fear like that?" "Everything," Jon said simply. She absorbed this. Nodded once, slowly, with the deliberate quality of someone placing something in a specific location, where they intended to return to it later. "Your wolf likes me," she said, changing direction the way she always did when she'd gotten what she came for from a line of conversation. "Ghost likes almost nobody. He followed me from the gate to the tower and back. He sat outside Mormont's solar for 2 hours. She looked at Ghost, who was lying by the fire watching her with the red-eyed attention he reserved for things he'd decided were worth watching. Wolves know things about people. Yes, Jon said. They do. She looked at him again, and this time there was something in the look that was less inventory and more simple attention. The look of a person who is genuinely present rather than gathering information. "Mance said to trust you," she said. "I don't usually trust people because someone else tells me to. Reasonable policy. But I'm good at reading people, and you read." She stopped, tried again. "You read like someone who has already been through something that would have broken most people and came out of it with a different relationship to what matters." Jon picked up the blade and turned it in the light, checking the edge. "Or I read like someone who learned to pretend," he said. "No," she said, with the certainty of someone who does not guess. "Not that." She left the armory shortly after, taking the cold with her the way the cold goes when a fire is built properly. Not all at once, but in stages, so you don't notice it until it's gone. Jon finished the blade he was working on and started another, and Ghost came and lay against his leg, and the armory was warm and purposeful and quiet. The next 3 weeks moved with the pace of things that were building towards something, fast enough to feel, slow enough to watch. Ygritte became a feature of Castle Black in the way that unusual things become features. First noticed, then commented on, then argued about, then eventually simply present and factored in. She trained with the recruits twice, at Jon's invitation, and demonstrated the composite bow with a precision that made even Thorn go briefly quiet. And she said things to the recruits during those sessions that had a different quality from Thorn's instruction, not softer, but differently honest, the honesty of someone who fought for life rather than for discipline. Thorn watched her with wariness, and something he would never have admitted was respect. She and Jon fell into a rhythm that neither of them named or organized. Evenings in the armory, working on the dragonglass stores. Mornings where she would appear at whatever he was doing with a piece of information or an observation or an argument she wanted to finish from the night before. She corrected him about the free folk with the comprehensive patience of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding, and he let her, because most of what she was correcting was real, and the rest was a style of engagement he'd have been stupid to waste. "You call them wildlings," she said one morning. They were on the wall because she had decided the wall needed to be walked and had appointed herself to walk it, and Jon had, without really deciding to, ended up walking it with her. "Why? It's what they're called. It's what you call them, it's not what they call themselves." She looked south over the edge at the world below. "Free folk, people who live outside your castles and your kings and your rules that say who owns what land and who was born to what station." She glanced at him. "You, of all people, should understand why that's worth something." "Me of all people," he repeated. "Bastard son of a lord. No name worth using, no station that'll hold. You're not so far from free folk as you think." Jon looked north over the other edge, the dark forest and the white distance and the invisible threat moving somewhere in all that gray. "I'm further than you think," he said, "and closer than I look." She stopped walking and turned to face him on the wall, with the wind and the enormous height, the world in both directions. "That's a very mysterious thing to say." "I know. Are you going to explain it?" "Not yet." She searched his face for a moment with those sharp eyes and then turned back to walking, which he understood as acceptance. She was the kind of person who knew the difference between a secret being kept and a truth being timed, and she respected the difference even when she didn't like it. "My parents were free folk," she said after a few minutes. "My father was a Harlaw man. My mother was from a cave clan north of the Frostfangs." She said it without sentiment, just information. "I've been south of the wall twice. Once I was taken, once I came back on my own." She paused. "Both times I came back north." "Why?" Jon said. "Because south of the wall everything has an owner," she said. "The land, the roads, the words you're allowed to say about the Lord. North of the wall the cold tries to kill you every day, but at least the cold doesn't tell you who you are." Jon was quiet for a moment. He thought about Aegon Targaryen and Jon Snow and the bastard of Winterfell and the Lord Commander, all the different versions of himself that different people had needed him to be, and how none of them had ever felt exactly like the thing that was underneath all of them. "I understand that better than you know," he said. She didn't say anything. The wind came off the north. After a moment she said, "The ghost grass is growing. Have you heard of it?" "Yes. It grows where the cold things have been. Where the dead have been. It's spreading south faster than it was last year." She stopped walking and looked north. "At the rate it's spreading, they have less time than Mance thinks." Jon turned to look at her. "How much less?" 2 years, maybe 3, not 5. This was new. This was the piece of the puzzle he hadn't had, not from memory, not from what Mance had told him. He stored it immediately and felt the recalibration happen, the timeline shifting in his head, the urgency ratcheting up by a meaningful notch. "Thank you," he said. "That matters." She looked at him with a slight frown, not unfriendly, the frown of someone encountering behavior they don't have a category for. "For what? Most people share information and want something back. You just told me something important because it was relevant." "That's how information works," she said. "Hoarding it doesn't make you safer, sharing it does." "Most people south of the wall would disagree. Most people south of the wall are—" She stopped herself, looked at him. A different kind of look this time, something that was looking at him and not at anything he represented. "You're not most people south of the wall." "No," Jon said. "I'm not." The look held for a moment. Then she turned and walked on, and Jon fell back into step beside her, and the wall stretched in both directions. And below them to the north the forest went on and on and on, and something out there was patient and cold and coming. And standing on top of the wall with the wind in his face, Jon felt something he hadn't felt in his first life until it was almost too late. The clear conviction that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. He was not ahead of everything, he knew that. The timeline Ygritte had given him meant he had less room than he'd calculated, and there were still a dozen moving pieces he hadn't secured. His father in King's Landing, the political will for the Wildling Passage, the dragonglass at Dragonstone, the larger coalition that was still years from being what it needed to be. The conspiracy at Castle Black was developing. He could feel it in the temperature of certain rooms and the specific quality of Alistair Thorne's watchfulness. But he was building. That was the difference. In his first life he had been reactive, always arriving at the crisis one step behind. This time he was building toward the shape he needed, one alliance, one supply line, one piece of real knowledge at a time. He thought about Melisandre. She was at Dragonstone, or would be soon. He wasn't certain of the exact timing. The Red Priestess who had believed in him before she'd understood what she was believing in, who had burned people and made terrible choices, and also done the single most important thing anyone had done for the living cause, which was bring him back. In this life, he didn't need her to bring him back. He needed her for something more specific, the fire she could summon, the influence she carried with Stannis Baratheon, and the fact that she could look at a man and tell his blood from someone else's. He needed her to say what he was when the time was right. "You went somewhere just now," Ygritte said. "Thinking," Jon said. "About what?" "The pieces I still need." She looked at him with the sideways directness of someone standing beside you rather than across from you. "What pieces?" "A stone island to the east with caves full of volcanic glass. A red priestess who believes in a god I'm not sure exists. A queen across the sea who doesn't know yet that she's necessary." He paused. "And the political will to do something that half the realm will call madness. Letting the free folk through the wall," she said. "That and other things." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it going to work?" Jon looked north, at the dark forest and the white distance and the invisible patience of whatever was building out there. "I don't know," he said. "In my experience, whether something works comes down to whether the right people decide to give it the same weight at the same time. And if they don't, then we do it anyway and carry them along." Jon said, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him fully. She was standing close in the way that standing on a narrow walkway with wind on both sides tends to produce closeness, and her face had the particular quality it sometimes had in firelight, stripped of the assessment, stripped of the inventory, just present and alive and looking at him. "Mance was right," she said quietly. "You are strange. I know. I haven't decided yet if it's a problem." "Fair enough," Jon said. She held his gaze for one more moment. And then the wind came hard off the north and she turned into it and walked on, and he walked beside her. And below them, Castle Black was going about its day, and beyond the wall the dead were patient. And Jon Snow was 2 months into his second life, and already further along than he had any right to be. Far south, though he couldn't know it in this specific moment, a woman sat in a tower room on a volcanic island and woke from a dream of fire and dark water, and a young man's face she didn't recognize yet, and put her hand to the flame of her candle and held it there, feeling the warmth that never burned her, and said quietly to the empty room, "He is coming back to himself." And in the Dothraki Sea, a silver-haired girl with purple eyes looked east at dawn and felt something shift, the way you feel weather changing before the cloud arrives, a pressure difference in the world, something large beginning to move. Neither of them knew what it meant yet. Jon Snow did. He kept walking north, into the wind, toward the edge of everything, with a spearwife at his side and a white wolf at his heel, and the whole broken world ahead of him waiting to be made into something that could hold. Chapter 5. The trader's name, the Raven from King's Landing, arrived on a gray morning in the 4th month, when the wall was sweating meltwater down its southern face, and the yard was soft with mud that sucked at boots and made the morning training sessions feel like punishment designed by someone creative. Jon was eating breakfast when the steward brought it. He knew from the look on the steward's face, a kind of careful blankness that people wear when they're carrying something they suspect is bad, and from the seal, which was the direwolf of House Stark pressed into gray wax rather than Ned's personal seal, which meant it had been sent by someone other than his father or in circumstances where his father's seal was unavailable. He broke it at the table and read it twice. "Robb writes to tell you father is held in the black cells, charged with treason. The king is dead, Robert the Boar. Joffrey holds the throne. Cersei moves against all father's allies. Robb is mobilizing. I have told him what you said. He is not marching yet, but he will not hold much longer. We need you. Sansa, who is also in the city and frightened but well." Jon set the letter down, picked up his spoon, ate 3 more bites of porridge with the mechanical focus of a man keeping his hands busy so his mind could work. Then he stood, folded the letter into his jacket, and went to find Mormont. Mormont read it standing up, by the window of his solar, with the raven on his shoulder making small disapproving sounds. When he finished, he looked at Jon with the pale direct gaze he used for serious matters. "Your father." "Yes. What do you want to do?" It was the right question. Not what can the watch do, not this is watch business, just the plain human version. Jon had been prepared for the harder conversation. "I need a raven sent to Robb Stark immediately. I'll write it now." He kept his voice level and practical, because practical was the only register that was useful right now. "I need him to hold the mobilization until I tell him otherwise. Not forever, I know he can't, not with father in the black cells, but long enough for me to work a different angle." "What angle?" "The Lannisters need Ned Stark alive more than they need him dead," Jon said. "He's a hostage and a bargaining chip and a symbol. Executing him gains them nothing but enemies in the north. If someone can make Cersei understand that the political cost of his execution outweighs the risk of keeping him alive, she'll keep him alive." He paused. "There's a man at court, Varys, the master of whisperers. He has his own interests in stability and his own network, and he is not Lannister property. If he can be reached through the right channel—" "You're talking about court politics," Mormont said. "I'm talking about my father's life. Jon said without heat, and about whether Robb Stark marches south and starts a war that kills 100,000 people and destabilizes the realm before we're anywhere near ready to face what's coming from the north. He met the Lord Commander's eyes. Both things are true at the same time, my lord. I need father alive. I also need the realm in one piece. Right now those are the same problem. Mormont handed back the letter. Write your raven to Robb Stark. I'll have the Maester send it before midday. He paused. And Snow, I'm not leaving the wall, Jon said, preempting it. Mormont looked at him with the complicated expression he'd been developing for the past 4 months, the one that had started as assessment and had moved through cautious approval and had arrived somewhere in the territory of something a man like Mormont would never call pride but which functioned roughly similarly. I wasn't going to order you to stay, he said. I was going to say I'm sorry about your father. Jon absorbed this. Thank you, my lord. He went to the Maester's cell and wrote 2 ravens. One to Robb, as he'd said, hold the mobilization. Father has more value to Cersei alive. Contact varies through a blind channel. Do not march without my word, and I will give you my word the moment it is necessary. Trust me once more. One to Sansa, shorter, more careful, written with the specific awareness that Sansa Stark was in a lion's den and her ravens might be read before they were sent. You are not alone. Be small and be patient. Remember what I told you. I am working. He sealed them both and handed them to the Maester, and then he stood in the corridor outside the Maester's cell for approximately 30 seconds with his hand flat against the cold stone wall, feeling the cold of it. He had changed things. His father was in the black cells rather than on a headsman's block, which meant something had worked. The warning about Littlefinger, maybe, or the instruction to distrust the master of coin, or simply the extra vigilance of a man who knew where the knives were coming from. But in the black cells was not out of the black cells, and a Lannister queen who felt threatened was not a queen who made rational calculations about political costs. He had not saved his father. Not yet. He had only postponed the blade. He allowed himself 30 seconds of feeling that, and then he pushed off the wall and walked back toward the yard, because despair was a resource he could not afford to spend here, and there was too much that needed his hands. He noticed the change in Thorn that same afternoon. It had been building for weeks, a specific quality of watchfulness that had different texture from Thorn's ordinary comprehensive suspicion of everything and everyone. This was targeted. This was a man who had made a decision and was watching for the right moment. Jon had known it was coming, had known the names and the mechanics, and had been waiting for the configuration to declare itself clearly enough that he could act on it rather than just anticipate. The configuration declared itself during afternoon sparring. Thorn paired Jon with a ranger named Brant, not one of the recruits, which was unusual, a fully trained man with 5 years of ranging experience, and the kind of build that was designed to be physically intimidating. The pairing was not accidental. Jon knew it wasn't accidental because of the way Thorn positioned himself to watch, and because Ollie was standing at the edge of the yard with a particular expression that Jon recognized with a specific cold pain. Not hatred, not yet, but the beginning of the story that would become hatred, the first page of it, which was fear and confusion, and a boy who needed something to blame for the enormous unfairness of his own life. Ollie was 11 years old. His entire village had been massacred by wildlings in Jon's first timeline, and that grief had been weaponized by Thorn into the knife he'd driven into Jon's chest. In this timeline, the village massacre had not happened yet. Jon had been building toward preventing it, through the alliance with Mance, through the passage rites, through the attempt to redirect the pressure that was building behind the wall into something organized rather than desperate. But Ollie was still a boy learning to be afraid of the wrong things, and Thorn was still a man who knew how to teach that lesson. Jon sparred with Brant with the clean efficiency of someone who was present in the physical task, and thinking about 4 other things simultaneously. Brant was good, genuinely good, with the measured aggression of an experienced fighter rather than the show aggression of someone trying to make a point. Jon respected it and beat him anyway, and he beat him in a way that was clinical rather than punishing, ending it with a disarm rather than a strike, which left Brant's dignity intact and delivered the message without the editorial. Thorne's face, watching, was unreadable. Afterward in the armory, Jon found Ygritte. She had been there more than the armory warranted, in the way she'd begun to turn up in a lot of places that Jon's work took him, not following, never following, but arriving with her own reasons that happened to coincide with his location, which was its own kind of thing. She was running a whetstone down the edge of one of the dragonglass blades with the focused rhythm of someone who found blade maintenance meditative. "Thorne's moving," Jon said, sitting down across from her. She didn't look up. "I know." "I've been watching him." "You've been watching Thorne." "I watch everything," she said, without any particular emphasis. "He's been meeting with 3 men after the evening watch change. Same corner of the common hall, same approximate time. Bowen Marsh is one. The other 2 are rangers I don't know well." Jon felt the shape of it settle. Bowen Marsh, the steward, the castle's effective administrator, a man whose competence Jon had never doubted and whose cowardice under existential pressure he understood. And Thorne. And whoever else had been recruited by the combination of genuine fear and institutional resentment that had produced the conspiracy in his first life. In his first life he had not seen it coming until it was already around him in a circle in the dark. In this life, he had been seeing it coming for 3 months. The question he had been carrying was not whether but how to address it in a way that didn't simply suppress the fear that was driving it, because suppressed fear grew in the dark into something worse, but that brought it into the open where it could be examined. He had been thinking about this carefully. He had a plan. But the raven from King's Landing had changed the timing of everything, had made certain things more urgent and others less stable, and he needed to move before the instability gave Thorne the cover to act. "How long have they been meeting?" Jon asked. 2 weeks that I've seen. Could be longer." Ygritte set down the whetstone. "What are you going to do?" "Something that needs to be public," Jon said. "I need witnesses." She looked at him with the sharp, direct quality of someone who understood consequences. "If you challenge Thorne, even if you win—" "I'm not going to challenge Thorne," Jon said. "I'm going to give him the chance to challenge himself." He paused. "Tomorrow morning, training yard. I need everyone there, recruits, rangers, stewards, Mormont, if I can manage it." He looked at her. "Can you make sure Mance's liaison report is delivered to Mormont before the morning assembly? I asked Sam to draft it, but I want it in Mormont's hands specifically as people are gathering." She studied him for a moment. "You're going to do everything at once." "The pieces are in position," Jon said. "Holding them in position costs energy that I need for other things. And if it goes wrong, then I've misjudged Mormont and Thorne moves the timeline up and we're in a harder place than we are now. But I don't think I've misjudged Mormont." Jon picked up one of the finished dragonglass blades and turned it in the firelight, checking the edge. "And I know I haven't misjudged Thorne." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Tell me what you need me to do," she said. He told Sam that night. Sam received the outline of the plan with the careful expression he wore when he was processing something that had multiple stages and wanted to be sure he had all of them. He was sitting on his bunk in the dormitory, a book open on his lap that he'd stopped pretending to read. "You're going to name yourself," Sam said when Jon finished, "in front of everyone." "Yes." "Aegon Targaryen." Sam said the name slowly, feeling the weight of it. "Yes." "That's—" Sam paused. He thought for a moment with the methodical thoroughness that was his best quality. "That's either the thing that solves everything or the thing that makes everything immediately more dangerous." "Both," Jon said, "at the same time, which is generally how important things work. The Watch swears no allegiance to kings." "I know. That's not why I'm naming myself. I'm not naming myself to claim the watch. I'm naming myself because the conspiracy against me is built on a version of who I am that is incomplete, and the version that is complete changes the calculation for every man in that yard. He met Sam's eyes. Thorne's argument against me to the men he's been recruiting is that I'm dangerous to the watch. That I'm too radical, too willing to deal with wildlings, too much a threat to the institution. That argument works against Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, because Jon Snow's authority is institutional and the institution can question it. But it doesn't work against Aegon Targaryen, Sam said slowly. It becomes a different conversation entirely. You can argue that Jon Snow is making bad decisions. It's harder to argue that a Targaryen with a legitimate claim to the Iron Throne is merely a problematic recruit. Sam was quiet for a moment. What does it do to the Watch's independence? Their whole identity is that they serve no king. It doesn't change their independence, Jon said. I'm not asking to be their king. I'm asking to be their colleague with a different kind of weight behind his name. There's a difference. He paused. And more practically, if the realm is going to survive what's coming from the north, it needs leadership that can unite the south and the north simultaneously. The Watch holding the wall while a Targaryen heir unites the kingdoms is not a contradiction. It's a strategy. Sam looked at him for a long time. You've been thinking about this for months. Since before I arrived here, Jon said, which was true in the most precise possible sense. I'll have the report ready before first light, Sam said. And Jon, he stopped. What? For what it's worth, Sam said carefully, in the tone of a man who had thought about something from multiple angles and kept arriving at the same answer. I think you're right about this. Not just the tactical piece. I think the world has been doing well enough by having Jon Snow in it. I don't see why it shouldn't do even better having Aegon Targaryen. Jon looked at his friend, at the good-natured, earnest face, the steady eyes, the specific quality of loyalty that asked nothing unreasonable and gave everything it had, and felt something that had no polite name, the thing that sits between gratitude and love and doesn't need to be either. Go to sleep, Sam, he said. Right, Sam said, and went back to his book, and the dormitory was warm and quiet, and Jon lay in the dark and thought about morning. He was in the training yard before anyone else, in the half-light before dawn when Castle Black was the specific gray of a held breath. Ghost came with him, sitting at his feet and looking at the yard with the ancient patience of a creature that knew how to wait. He had chosen his clothing deliberately, not his black watch cloak, but his own shirt and a plain leather jerkin, nothing that looked like performance. The worst thing he could do was look like he'd prepared a speech. What was coming needed to look like honesty rather than theater. They came in the usual order, recruits first, then stewards, then rangers filtering in from the night watch change. Ygritte arrived early and positioned herself against the east wall of the yard with the studied casualness of someone who had chosen a spot for functional rather than aesthetic reasons. Good sight lines, close to the gate, far enough from the main group to observe without being part of it. Jon caught her eye across the yard. She gave him nothing readable, which was its own message. I'm here. Whatever you do now, I'm here. Sam appeared from the tower with a rolled parchment and went directly to the stairs that led to Mormont's Solar, moving with the purposeful haste of someone who had been told the timing mattered. Jon watched him go and turned back to the yard. Thorne arrived with Bowen Marsh at his shoulder and 2 rangers behind him, and the arrangement of it was visible even to people who hadn't been watching. The specific proximity, the way they spread through the yard not randomly, but in the particular configuration of men who have prearranged positions. 2 more men Jon recognized from his first life's worst night drifted to the edges of the group. Thorne came to the center of the yard and looked at Jon with the expression he'd been carrying for weeks, the one that had moved past calculation into something colder and more resolved. Snow, he said, We need to speak, all of us. Good, Jon said. I've been thinking the same thing. Something shifted in Thorne's face, surprise quickly managed. He had not expected that response. Your activities here have become a matter of concern, Thorne said. He had moved into the formal cadence he used when he wanted the authority of institution, rather than personality behind his words. The voice of the Master-at-Arms making an official statement. You have been conducting unauthorized negotiations with wildling representatives. You have been lobbying the Lord Commander on matters outside your station. You have made unauthorized modifications to the castle's weapon stores. You have cultivated relationships with the recruits under your charge in ways that undermine the chain of command. He paused. And you have been storing information about this castle's security protocols, patrol patterns, and strategic weaknesses in ways that suggest preparation for something other than loyal service. The yard was very quiet. The recruits were still, most of them watching Jon with expressions that had varying mixtures of alarm and the particular loyalty that 4 months of deliberate investment had produced. Even Gren, who was not sophisticated about politics, had drawn himself up straighter, and Pip's eyes were moving between Thorne and Jon with sharp attention. Jon looked at Thorne for a moment. Then he looked around the yard, at every face, taking his time, meeting eyes. When he spoke to all of them, not to Thorne specifically, which Thorne would register as a rebuff, and which was intended to be one. Sir Alizer is right about most of that, Jon said. I have been doing all of those things. He let that sit. I've been doing them because there is a war coming that the Night's Watch cannot fight in its current condition, and because I arrived here knowing that and decided that waiting for someone else to address it was a luxury we don't have. The Watch will decide its own strategy, Thorne said. The Watch has been deciding its own strategy for 200 years, Jon said, still pleasantly. And the strategy it has arrived at involves 900 men, minimal dragonglass stores, no alliance with the free folk who actually know what they're facing, and no communication with the southern kingdoms about what is going to be required of them when the dead reach the wall. He turned to look at Thorne fully now. With respect, Sir Alizer, that strategy is going to get everyone in this castle and everyone south of this wall killed, and I am not prepared to stand aside and let that happen because it would be more comfortable for the institution. You are a recruit, Bowen Marsh said from Thorne's left. Marsh had a round face that went red when he was agitated, and it was very red now. You have been here 5 months. You speak as though you have authority you simply do not have. My authority, Jon said carefully, doesn't come from my time here. It comes from what I know. What you claim to know, Thorne said. And I have been patient about that, about this air of certainty you carry, the foreknowledge you seem to have about threats and timelines and the movements of wildling armies. I've been patient because some of what you've said has proven accurate. His voice hardened. But patience has limits, and what I will not tolerate is a man who is using this castle as a base to build a political position for himself at the expense of the Watch's neutrality and independence. You think I'm here for personal ambition, Jon said. I think you're exactly the kind of clever, capable man who represents a specific kind of danger, Thorne said. And here was the thing about Thorne that made him worth taking seriously rather than simply dismissing. He was not wrong, in the narrow sense. Jon was building something here. Jon did have an agenda that went beyond simple loyal service. Thorne's read of him was more accurate than most, and I think the Watch deserves to know who it is actually dealing with. Then let's tell them, Jon said. He looked at the yard again, at the assembled faces, the recruits and the rangers and the stewards, and now he could see from the corner of his eye Mormont at the top of the stairs from the tower, Mormont with Sam behind him holding the parchment, Mormont with his pale glacier eyes and his comprehensive assessment of everything. Jon thought about the name. He thought about Lyanna dying and Rhaegar's voice, and the secret his father had carried for 17 years. He thought about what it meant to say it here in this yard to these men, in a world that was not ready for it and might never be, and he thought, it doesn't matter if the world is ready. The world is rarely ready for the things it needs. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter Sam had helped him draft 3 weeks ago, the one he had been carrying as a kind of preparation, not because he needed the text, but because having it physical had been his way of making the decision real to himself, and he set it on the ground at the center of the yard with the same deliberateness he would have set a sword. "My name is not Jon Snow," he said, clear, unhurried, loud enough for the yard and no further. "That is the name I was given to protect me. My name is Aegon Targaryen. My father was Rhaegar Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone, and my mother was Lyanna Stark, sister to Eddard Stark of Winterfell. Their marriage was legal and witnessed. I am the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne of the Seven Kingdoms." The yard went the specific silence of something that has stopped processing and has not yet started again. Jon stood in the middle of it and waited. Thorne had gone very still. His face had moved through surprise and arrived somewhere he hadn't prepared for, not the easy contempt of a man dismissing a lie, but the expression of someone encountering a claim that was too specific to be pure invention and too enormous to be immediately categorized. Bowen Marsh said, in a voice somewhat reduced from its normal volume. "That's treason," Thorne said, and his voice had recovered its edge. "That's what it is. A bastard claiming a dead dynasty. I am not claiming anything from the Watch," Jon said, cutting through it cleanly. "The Watch swears no allegiance to kings, and I am not asking for yours. I am telling you who I am because Sir Alizer is correct that you deserve to know who you're dealing with." He looked at Thorne directly. "You built your case against me on the idea that I was a clever recruit overstepping his authority. I want you to consider your case again with the correct information." He paused. "And I want you to understand that the same things I've been doing in this castle, the alliance negotiations, the supply audits, the ranging modifications, the dragonglass stores, I have been doing in my capacity as the man who knows most precisely what is coming and has the most comprehensive obligation to prevent it, not as Lord Commander, not as a king, but as the person who has the information and the ability and the specific understanding that if we don't solve this together, we don't survive it at all." Thorne looked at him. The yard waited. From the stairs, Mormont's voice, "Sir Alizer." Thorne turned slowly. Mormont descended the stairs with the unhurried weight of a man who had been listening for some time and had arrived at the bottom of his patience and the top of his decision. He looked at Thorne with the pale-eyed assessment of a Lord Commander who had led the Watch for longer than most of the men in the yard had been alive. "I have been made aware of your meetings," Mormont said. "I am aware of who attended them and what was discussed. I was allowing them to develop because I wanted to understand their scope before addressing them." He stood in the center of the yard, equidistant from Thorne and Jon, which was itself a geometrically significant choice. "I will not have conspiracy in this castle, not from wildlings, not from kings, and not from my own master-at-arms." Thorne's jaw was tight. "My Lord Commander, if you understood the nature of this man—" "I understand him considerably better than you think," Mormont said, in a tone that closed the door on that argument definitively. He looked at Thorne for a long moment, and the look was not unkind. It was the look of a man who had fought beside another man for long enough to have complex feelings about what he was seeing him become. "I want your word in this yard in front of these men that you will bring concerns about strategy and personnel through proper channels. That is all I require." It was the offer Thorne hadn't expected. Not discipline, not removal, not the political destruction of a career. A door. Mormont was offering him a door. Thorne looked at Jon. Jon met his gaze and held it without expression, without triumph, without anything except the steady attention of someone who had made a decision about this man months ago that had nothing to do with defeating him and everything to do with keeping him functional. Thorne looked back at Mormont. "You have my word, my lord," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man swallowing something that did not go down easily. Mormont nodded once. "The rest of you, back to your duties." The yard dissolved, slowly, and with the particular charged quality of a group of people who had witnessed something significant and needed time to process it. Jon stood as they moved around him, watching the dispersal, cataloging who was watching him with what expression, Gren with an open admiration he hadn't bothered to conceal, Pip with the delighted intensity of a man who had just watched something that would be retold for years, Sam with the carefully contained relief of someone who had believed in the outcome and was now relieved to have been right. Ollie stood at the yard's edge, and Jon looked at him, at the 11-year-old boy with his father's death somewhere in his future, and Thorne's narrative waiting to be poured into him like a mold. Ollie was looking back at Jon with an expression that was confused and young and not yet decided, the expression of someone who has heard something that disrupts the story they were beginning to accept. Jon walked to him. Ollie straightened slightly, defensive. "What you heard today," Jon said, quietly enough that it was between them. "I need you to hold it open for a while before you decide what to think about it. Can you do that?" Ollie looked at him. "Are you really a Targaryen?" "Yes." "Why are you here?" "At the wall, if you're—" "Because the wall is where the real war is," Jon said. "Because none of the rest of it, the thrones, the names, the blood, matters if the dead come south and there's nothing left to rule." He looked at the boy steadily. "The wildlings killed your family," Jon said, and Ollie went rigid. "I know, and I am not asking you to forgive that or forget it. I'm asking you to understand that the people who did it were desperate and frightened and being pushed south by something that would have killed them too, and that the answer to that is not more killing." He paused. "Your family deserved better, and the way I honor that is not by destroying the free folk. It's by stopping what was driving them." Ollie was very still. His face was doing something complex and young and painful, the face of someone whose grief was being given a direction it hadn't had before. "You can be angry at me," Jon said. "That's fine. Just don't let anyone else point that anger for you." He left Ollie standing at the yard's edge and went to find Thorne. Thorne was in the armory, alone, cleaning a sword that didn't need cleaning. Jon came in and closed the door behind him, and Thorne looked up with the face of a man who had composed himself and was holding the composition together with some effort. "Come to finish it," Thorne said. "No," Jon said. "Come to offer you something." He sat down on the bench across from him, the same bench Ygritte had used. "You are the best training master this watch has. I was lying when I said I'd been told differently. I've been told exactly that. And the watch needs good training masters more than it needs political convenience." He looked at Thorne steadily. "What I'm building here requires the watch to actually function. That means I need you, specifically you, to keep doing what you do, and I'm asking you directly." Thorne looked at him for a long moment. "You revealed yourself as a Targaryen heir in the middle of my play to remove you," he said, "and now you're asking me to stay on." "Yes, that's either the most arrogant thing I've ever seen or the most practical." "Probably both," Jon said. "I've been told I combine them well." Thorne set down the sword. He looked at Jon with the complex expression he'd been developing for months, the one that had never quite resolved into either contempt or respect but had always been something between and above both. "What you did today," he said, "naming yourself, that name will travel, ravens carry, people talk. Half the realm is going to hear within a month that a Targaryen claimant is running the Night's Watch. I know. That changes things politically in ways you may not be able to control. I know that too. Jon met his gaze. I've been living with the knowledge of things I can't control for my entire life, Sir Alizer. What I can control is whether the men in this castle are ready for what's coming. That's what I'm asking you to help me do. Thorne was quiet for a long time. The armory fire shifted. Somewhere outside, the evening watch was changing. I don't like you, Thorne said finally. I want to be clear about that. You are arrogant and presumptuous, and you have been manipulating this castle's political situation since the day you arrived. And the fact that your reasons are arguably good does not make the methods less irritating. Understood, Jon said. But I have been here 30 years, Thorne continued, and now his voice had a different quality, something older and more tired, the voice of the man under the institution, the one that had been there before the rigidity set in. I have seen the watch decline from 3,000 men to 900. I have watched the realm forget us, dismiss us, send us their criminals and their broken men and call it support. I have watched commanders come and go with different strategies and the same result. He looked at the sword in his hands. If what you know is real, and I am not certain that I believe you, but I am not certain that I don't, then the alternative to doing it your way is doing it the way we have been doing it. And the way we have been doing it is not working. Jon waited. I'll train your recruits, Thorne said. I'll keep training them the same way I always have. And if I have concerns about your strategy, I will bring them to Mormont as the Lord Commander instructed. He looked up. But I want something from you. Name it. Honesty, Thorne said. Not the partial version you've been giving us. Full honesty about what you know and how when it's operationally relevant. No more discovering things after they've already happened and acting like you predicted them. He held Jon's gaze. I can work with a Targaryen who knows more than he should. I cannot work with one who keeps me blind. Jon thought about this. About the line between what was useful to share and what would take too long to explain or would destabilize rather than help. He thought about Thorne's track record in his first life and his revised assessment of this version. The man who had just chosen a door over a fight, who had enough honesty to name his own distaste while setting it aside for something more important. Agreed, Jon said. What I know and how I know it, I'll tell you what I can when it matters. And the rest I'll tell you I don't have an explanation for, rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Thorne looked at him for one more moment. Then he picked up the sword and went back to cleaning it, and the motion was dismissal and acceptance simultaneously, which was exactly the kind of complicated resolution that Jon had learned to value over simple ones. Jon stood to leave. Snow, Thorne said, without looking up. Sir Alizer, your mother was Lyanna Stark. He said it to the sword, not to Jon. I knew of her, not personally, but she was. He stopped. His voice had the quality of someone handling something carefully. She deserved better than dying in a tower alone. Whatever else is true. Jon stood in the doorway of the armory and felt something move through him that was old and specific. The grief of a man mourning a mother he never met and whose absence had shaped the entire geography of his life. Yes, he said. She did. He walked out into the evening yard, where the torches were being lit along the wall's base, and the first stars were appearing over the battlements. And Ygritte was leaning against the east wall with her arms crossed, watching him cross the yard with the particular patient attention of someone who had been prepared to intervene if necessary and was quietly pleased that intervention had not been required. Well, she said. It held, Jon said. She studied his face. And Thorne. He'll be difficult and useful in approximately equal measure. Which is the most you can ask of Alizer Thorne, and probably more than he'd admit to himself. She looked at him for a moment, the full, present attention, no assessment in it now. You named yourself. Yes. Aegon, she said, testing the name in her mouth. Aegon Targaryen. It's my name. Jon suits you better, she said, with the directness that was always either a knife or a gift depending on how you caught it. "Jon Snow doesn't exist," he said, and heard the slight roughness in it that he hadn't intended. She pushed off the wall and stood in front of him. Close, the same close as the wall walkway, the wind proximity kind, except there was no wind here. "Jon Snow is the man who rode into Mance's camp alone," she said. "Jon Snow is the man who went beyond the wall to look at what was coming instead of waiting for it to arrive. Jon Snow is the man who spent 5 months building something in this castle that they told him he had no authority to build." She met his eyes with the unstruck, unperformative clarity that was one of the most disarming things about her. "Whatever your name is, that's the man I've been watching, and that man has nothing to apologize for." Jon looked at her for a long moment in the torchlit evening, the wall above them and the darkness beyond it, and the world on both sides of everything, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since he woke up in Winterfell's cold morning with his whole first life behind his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm just accurate." She turned and walked toward the common hall, and Ghost emerged from wherever he'd been observing the afternoon from and fell into step beside Jon, and the torches burned along the base of the wall, and somewhere to the south a raven was carrying his name toward Winterfell and King's Landing and eventually the whole of Westeros. Aegon Targaryen, Jon Snow, both, neither. The man who had died and come back and was still deciding which of those facts was more important. He looked up at the wall. It looked back. He went a find Sam because the dragonglass inventory needed finishing, and tomorrow the first supply request to Dragonstone needed to be sent, and there were still 100 things in motion, and the ghost grass was growing faster than Mance had thought. The work was not finished. It was barely started. He was beginning to think that might be all right. Chapter 6. The North remembers, and so does he. The ravens went out on a Tuesday. Jon had spent 3 days drafting them, which was not because the words were difficult to find, but because the order in which they were sent mattered, and the framing of each one had to account for the specific fears and loyalties of whoever was receiving it. Ravens were political instruments as much as they were communication, and he had learned in his first life that a poorly framed message could do more damage than silence. The first went to Robb Stark at Winterfell. Jon had been corresponding with his brother for months in the careful coded language of 2 people who understood that ravens could be intercepted. But this one was different. This one was plain, because the time for code had passed. "Robb, father lives. Keep him living by holding your army north of the neck until I tell you otherwise. I know what you want to do, and I know why. But the war you're imagining is not the war that needs to be fought. The real war is here at the wall, and I need the north intact and armed when it begins. There are things I need to tell you in person. Come to Castle Black. Bring Great John Umber if you'll come. Bring whoever you trust most. Come north, not south. Your brother Aegon." He had used that name deliberately. He needed Robb to know, and he needed Robb to have time to process it before they were face to face. The second went to Stannis Baratheon at Dragonstone. Jon knew Stannis' location, knew his general mood, knew the shape of his ambition and the specific quality of his honor, the rigid, uncompromising honor of a man who had decided that absolute principle was the only alternative to the corruption he despised. It was not the most comfortable kind of honor to work with, but it was the most reliable. "Lord Stannis, you know what your brother's queen has done. You know what you are owed by law and blood. I am not writing to argue the succession. I am writing because you have a castle sitting on the largest deposit of obsidian in the known world, and I need that obsidian more urgently than you need a political bargaining chip. The Night's Watch requests formal access to the dragonglass stores beneath Dragonstone. In exchange, I will tell you what is coming from the north, and why it makes every Southern Throne argument temporarily irrelevant. Jon Snow, formerly of the Night's Watch. Aegon Targaryen by birth of House Targaryen. That one had taken the most drafts. Stannis Baratheon was not a man who responded to charm or flattery, but he was a man who responded to direct statements of fact and clear exchange of value, and Jon had tried to give him that. The third went to Sansa, still in King's Landing, and was short enough to fit on a strip of paper small enough to conceal. Father will be offered a deal. Cersei needs him compliant more than dead. Tell him to take it. Bent knee and the wall, he lives. You both live. Trust no one who makes the alternative sound honorable. I love you. Come north when you can. The fourth he had argued with himself about for 2 full days, sitting with the blank parchment and the quill and going back and forth about timing and necessity and the question of whether the world was ready. Then he had thought about the ghost grass growing faster than expected and Ygritte's 2-year timeline, and the 900 men at the wall who were going to face 100,000 dead with 500 dragonglass blades. And he had written it. It went east, across the narrow sea, to a city called Meereen, where a silver-haired queen was in the process of learning that liberating a city and holding a city were different educations. To Daenerys Targaryen, Queen of Meereen, Breaker of Chains, Mother of Dragons. My name is Aegon Targaryen. I am your nephew. My father was Rhaegar. My mother was Lyanna Stark of Winterfell. I do not write to contest your claim or complicate your plans. I write because there is a war coming that your dragons are necessary to fight, and because you deserve to know that you are not the last Targaryen, and because whatever else is true, we are the last of a house that the world decided was finished, and I think we should decide that for ourselves. Send a raven to Castle Black at the wall in the north of Westeros. I will answer it. Your nephew, Aegon. He had sealed that one himself and given it to the Maester with specific instructions about the routing. And then he had not thought about it again, because thinking about it would not make it arrive faster, and there were too many other things demanding his attention. The morning after the ravens went out, Jon was on the wall when Ygritte found him. He was not brooding. He had been accused of brooding in his first life often enough that he had become conscious of the distinction between standing in a high place, thinking useful thoughts, and standing in a high place being decoratively melancholy. He was thinking useful thoughts. Specifically, he was thinking about the logistics of the Wildling Passage, the staging areas, the timing, the watch's capacity to supervise the crossing at multiple gates simultaneously, the question of how you moved 100,000 people through a fortification designed to move perhaps 100 at a time, without creating the kind of chaos that would get people killed and shatter the fragile political agreement that made the whole thing possible. Ygritte came up beside him and stood in her habitual way, looking north, the wind doing its work on her hair. She had been doing this for weeks now, finding him at altitude. He had not asked why. He understood that some things were answered by pattern rather than explanation. Mance sent another rider, she said, last night. I know, Sam told me. He's moving the timeline up. The ghost grass is past the Frostfangs. She said it with the flat directness of someone delivering a battlefield report, but he could hear the thing underneath it, the thing that people who had been raised north of the wall could never quite excise from their voice when they talked about the cold things, which was fear of a very specific and very old variety. He says he has 112 clans consolidated. Another 30 are still moving toward him. How long before he reaches the wall? 3 months, maybe less if the weather drives them. She looked at him sidelong. Mormont needs to move on the passage agreement. The discussion phase is done. Mormont knows, Jon said. He's been in correspondence with the commanders at Eastwatch and Shadow Tower for the past 2 weeks. Cotter Pike at Eastwatch is resistant. Denies Mallister at Shadow Tower is impossible. Cautious, Jon said, which was the generous version. He's an old man who has spent 40 years believing that wildlings at the gate means the watch has failed. Reconceiving that takes time. He doesn't have time. Number which is why I'm going to Shadow Tower next week. She turned to look at him. Yourself. Myself. That's a 4-day ride. I know. She looked at him with the particular searching quality that she deployed when she was trying to determine whether something was bravery or foolishness, the two things that she treated as functionally distinct where most people conflated them. I'll come, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said, with an edge that said the question had been interpreted as a challenge to her agency and found unimpressive. I said I'll come. Jon looked at her. The morning light was doing the specific thing it did to her face at this hour, direct and northern and unsparing. The kind of light that showed everything, and she looked back at him with the same openness, the same absolute unwillingness to perform a version of herself for anyone's comfort. And he felt the thing he'd been feeling for weeks with increasing frequency and decreasing ability to pretend he wasn't feeling it. Ygritte, he said. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Just clearly. I haven't said anything. You were about to say something careful, she said. Something that managed the situation. I could see you composing it. She looked north again. I don't need it managed. I know what this is. I know what you're carrying that you haven't told me about, not the Targaryen thing, something else, something older, and I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm telling you that whatever it is, it doesn't change what I can see from where I'm standing. Jon was quiet. What can you see from where you're standing? He said, eventually. She was quiet for a moment, and when she answered her voice had the quality it sometimes had when she had thought carefully about something, and had decided to be accurate rather than strategic. A man who came back from somewhere very far away, she said, and has been trying ever since to make sure the people he loves don't have to go to the same place. She glanced at him. I'm saying I see it. I'm not asking you to explain it. Jon looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in another life I was too slow. Too slow to do what? Everything, he said. I was too slow to say things and too slow to do things, and I spent a lot of time being careful when I should have been present. He held her gaze. I'm trying not to do that again. She absorbed this with the calm of someone who had expected something in the vicinity of what she'd received and was confirming the coordinates. Good, she said simply, and then she turned back to the north, and he turned back with her, and they stood on the wall together in the cold morning and watched the world that needed saving, and it was, in its way, the most honest thing that had passed between them. The riders from Winterfell arrived 6 days later. Jon heard the horns from the training yard and knew from the number of blasts, 3, the code for a large friendly party, and from the direction, and from a quality of the sound that he could not have explained but which registered somewhere in him that had nothing to do with logic, that it was Robb. He was right. Robb Stark came through the gates of Castle Black with 20 riders at his back, Grey Wind loping beside his horse, and the specific quality of a man who had ridden hard and fast, and with enormous purpose, and was managing the momentum of it. He was 18 years old, broad across the shoulders, wearing stark gray and looking more like their father than Jon had ever seen him, not in the features, which had always been Tully, but in the expression, which had arrived at the gravity of a man who had recently been given too much weight to carry, and had decided he was going to carry it properly. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and crossed the yard and grabbed Jon by the shoulders, and looked at him with the face of a brother conducting a rapid inspection for damage. You're the same, Robb said, which meant he had been half expecting otherwise. Did you think I wouldn't be? Your letter said Aegon Targaryen. Robb said it the way he might say the name of a thunderstorm that had arrived over his house. I've been looking at that name for 6 days trying to figure out what to do with it. Come inside, Jon said. I'll explain it properly. You'd better, Robb said. I told Mother where I was going and he stopped. She had feelings about it. She usually does, Jon said. Robb looked at him, at the change in him which Jon knew was visible and which Robb's eyes were now cataloging with the particular thoroughness of someone who had grown up in the same house and knew the original. "You're different," Robb said. "Arya said you were different when you left Winterfell. She said you had a face like you'd been somewhere and come back. She wasn't wrong. What happened to you?" "Long story," Jon said. "Best told inside with food." "The boy has something," he told Robb, loudly enough for Jon to hear, as though Jon were not standing directly in front of them. "I know," Robb said, with the combination of pride and exasperation that was his permanent register when it came to Jon. Jon sat them down in Mormont's hall, Mormont present, Sam present, Ygritte at the back with her arms crossed and her expression the evaluative one she wore when she was deciding how much respect to assign to new people, and he told them. Not all of it. Not the dying and the waking. Not the full mechanism of how he knew what he knew. That was a conversation for a specific audience and a specific moment, and this was not it. But he told them what was coming, fully and without softening. And he told them what was needed. And he told them why the war in the South was a catastrophe they needed to prevent rather than fight. He laid it out as a strategist laying out a battle plan, moving from the threat to the response to the resource requirements to the coalition structure, and he watched their faces move through it. Robb listened with the focused attention of someone who had inherited their father's ability to hear hard things without immediately trying to argue with them. Twice he started to say something and stopped himself. When Jon finished, he was quiet for a long moment and then he said, "The dead are real. Yes, you've seen them. Yes, and they're coming south. Within 2 years based on current movement, possibly less." Robb looked at Mormont. "You believe him." "I believe what my rangers have reported," Mormont said. "And I believe what his liaison from Mance Rayder has told me. And I believe the evidence in the stores and the supply records and the correspondence I've had with the Watch's other commanders." He paused. "Whether I believe the full scope of how he knows what he knows is a separate question. The practical answer is that everything he has predicted has been accurate. I act on accurate information." Robb looked at Jon again. "You said your mother was Lyanna." "Yes. My father never. He kept the secret she died asking him to keep. He didn't lie to you. He never confirmed and never denied. He protected me." Jon held his brother's gaze, his cousin's gaze technically, but that word did not exist between them and never would. "I am not using the Targaryen name to take anything from you, Robb. Not Winterfell, not the North, not whatever you build from here. The North is yours. It always was. What I need is for the North to be alive." Robb was quiet for another moment. Then something settled in his face, the resolution of a man who had done the weighing and arrived at an answer. "What do you need from me?" Jon had been waiting for that question since he wrote The Raven. He answered it fully, because Robb deserved the full version. He needed the North's food stores to begin surplus production beyond their usual pattern, because feeding 100,000 wildlings through a Westeros winter was not achievable on the Watch's supply budget alone. He needed Robb's political influence with the other northern lords, the Umbers, the Mormonts of Bear Island, the Karstarks, to begin building the case for a combined northern force that could march to the wall's defense when the time came. He needed Robb to not march south under any provocation, because every northern sword that died on a Lannister blade south of the neck was a sword that wasn't at the wall when it mattered. And he needed Robb to find a way to free their father from the Black Cells without starting a war. On this last point, Robb's jaw tightened in the way it always did when he was containing something large. "How?" "Stannis Baratheon is going to move against the throne," Jon said. "His claim is legitimate and his military capacity is real and Cersei knows it. When Stannis moves, Cersei is going to need every tool she has, and a Stark hostage becomes a liability rather than a resource." He paused. The timing matters. If we can make contact with Stannis, and I've already written him, and if Stannis moves before Cersei feels secure, she'll deal. Ned walks to the wall, bends his knee, gives Joffrey the public submission he needs and lives. Father will hate that, Robb said. Father nearly died for his honor in my previous experience of this situation, Jon said, and let that land and watched Robb's face go through something complicated. Living to fight the actual fight is worth more than any particular flag on the hill of principle. He'll understand that. Eventually. Robb sat back. He looked at the ceiling of Mormont's hall with the expression of a man doing calculations about the rest of his life. Then he looked at Jon. You said previous experience. Yes. Are you going to tell me what that means? Yes, Jon said. But not today. Today I need your answer. Robb looked at him for a long moment, the way he had looked at him across 1,000 shared moments in Winterfell's yards and halls. The look of a brother who had always known Jon was something particular without having the words for what particular meant. You have it, Robb said. All of it. Whatever you need. They spent 3 days in Castle Black, which was not enough and was all they had. Jon walked Robb through everything. The Dragonglass stores, the training improvements, the alliance framework with Mance, the supply projections, and he watched Robb absorbing it all with the same systematic thoroughness Robb had always applied to military problems. The same quality that had made him, briefly, the most feared battlefield commander in Westeros. On the second evening, they ended up in the common hall after the others had gone to bed, the two of them and Ghost, and a flagon of something the Watch called wine, but which had the characteristics of a decision you regretted in the morning. Tell me about her, Robb said. Who? Robb gestured with his cup toward the general direction where Ygritte had been sitting for most of dinner. He had the look of a man who had been observing something and had formed opinions. She's Mance's liaison, Jon said. She's something else as well, Robb said, with the ease of someone who had grown up watching Jon navigate his feelings with the specific skilled avoidance of a man who had decided feelings were a strategic liability. Don't do that thing where you explain what someone's official function is. Jon looked at his wine. It's complicated. Everything about you is complicated, specifically this. Jon thought about how to say it. She's the most honest person I know, which is a strange thing to be in a world like this one. Robb studied him. You love her. I've known her 4 months. Jon. It's complicated, Jon said again, which was not a denial, and they both knew it. In my experience, Robb said, with the authority of someone who had fallen in love once and married her against the advice of everyone, the complicated version and the simple version are usually the same thing. The complicated part is just everything you build around it to avoid being afraid of the simple part. Jon looked at his brother. When did you get wise? I rode 4 days north to help my brother fight the actual apocalypse, Robb said. It puts things in perspective. He drank. She looks at you like she's already decided something and is waiting for you to catch up. Jon thought about the wall walkway and whatever your name is, that's the man I've been watching. Yes, he said, she does. Then catch up, Robb said simply and refilled his cup. On the morning of the 3rd day, Jon found her in the armory. She was making arrows because she was always making something when she was thinking, and she looked up when he came in with the expression that had replaced the pure inventory look, the one that was simply present, simply attentive, the one he had liked from the moment it first appeared. Robb's leaving today, she said. Yes. Good man, she said. The assessment was concise and absolute, which from Ygritte was as thorough a recommendation as a formal citation. Honest. Doesn't pretend the North and the free folk want the same things, but he's willing to think about what we do want and whether it overlaps. That's Robb, Jon said. He's always been better at hearing people than politics would normally allow. She set down the arrow and looked at him with the direct quality that had stopped being an assessment and become simply the way she looked at him, as though she had decided at some point that full attention was the only honest way to engage with him and had committed to it. "You're going to Shadow Tower next week," she said. "We're going to Shadow Tower next week." The corner of her mouth moved. You said you'd come." "I did." She picked up the arrow again. And after Shadow Tower, Jon thought about the ravens he'd sent, about Stannis and Robb and Sansa, and the silver-haired queen across the sea who might or might not respond and might or might not be who he needed her to be, about the ghost grass growing and the timeline compressing and the 142 clans that needed to be moved through a wall that had never been designed for this particular use. After Shadow Tower, he said, "I need to go south." She looked up. "Not for long," he said. "There are things I need to see in person. People I need to meet face to face. Stannis needs to hear the threat from someone who can look him in the eye and make him believe it, and a letter isn't going to do that." He paused. "And there may be a fleet. If there's a fleet going east." "You're going to meet her," Ygritte said, not accusatory. Informational as she always was, laying the fact down to see what shape it made. "Daenerys," Jon said. "Yes, if she responds, if the timing works." "3 dragons," Ygritte said, with the particular quality of a woman who had grown up on stories of what dragons meant to the world north of the Wall. Not romantic stories, but honest ones. The stories of fire and stone and things that unmade what had been made. "You think she'll bring them?" "I think she'll come when she understands what's at stake. He thought about Daenerys Targaryen, his aunt, the woman who had broken chains across a continent and burned the careful calculus of empire and had wanted, underneath all of it, the same thing everyone wanted who had been told from birth that they were something lesser than what they were. She cares about the right things, she's just had to care about them in the wrong order." Ygritte absorbed this. "And you," she said, "2 Targaryens, 2 claims." "1 enemy," Jon said. "1 war. Everything else is negotiable." She held his gaze for a moment that was longer than the informational version needed. "You're going to go south," she said again, and this time there was something underneath it that she was deciding whether to name. "Ygritte," Jon said. "I know," she said. "I know you'll come back. It's not." She stopped. Started again with the deliberateness of someone who has decided on accuracy. "In the North we don't do what Southerners do with feelings. We don't make speeches about them. We either act on them or we don't, and the action is the statement." "I know," Jon said. "Then you know that I've been acting on something for 3 months," she said, "and I expect you've noticed." "Yes," Jon said. "Good," she said. "Then when you come back from wherever you're going, we can be practical about it." The corner of his mouth moved. "Practical," he repeated. "Don't make it into something flowery," she said, with the defensive edge that was her version of vulnerability. "I'm a practical person." "You are," Jon agreed. "You're the most practical person I know." "And you're an idiot sometimes," she said, and threw an arrow shaft at him, which he caught. And she went back to her fletching with the specific composed quality of someone who has said what needed saying, and is satisfied with the result. Jon sat on the bench across from her, the same bench, and for a while there was no sound except the arrows and the fire and Ghost dreaming something outside the door. And it was the kind of quiet that has arrived rather than simply descended, the quiet of something that has found its shape. On the day that Robb rode south, Jon stood on the wall and watched the party until it disappeared into the tree-lined gray wind, a moving shape alongside the horses. And he stayed there afterward because there were things the height helped with. The perspective. The way problems looked different when you could see the shape of the land they existed in. Sam came up behind him on the elevator and stood beside him with a new parchment, which meant news of some kind. He had developed a specific face for different categories of news, and Jon had learned to read them all. This face was the one for something significant and not entirely expected. "Raven from Dragonstone," Sam said, and handed it over. The seal was a stag on a field of black, which was Stannis Baratheon's personal seal. Jon broke it and read it. Snow. Or Targaryen, if you insist on the point. I have received your letter. I have read it 3 times. My Maester tells me I should ignore it. Lady Melisandre tells me I should not. She has been insistent on the matter, which is itself unusual, since she is insistent about most things and I have learned to discount it. And she is currently insisting about you specifically in a way that she has not insisted about anything in 6 months. I am writing to tell you that I will receive a delegation from the Night's Watch. I will not commit to anything before that meeting, but I will receive one. The caves below Dragonstone are available for inspection by the Watch's representative with appropriate escort. Come yourself. I want to see what she finds in you. Stannis Baratheon, Lord of Dragonstone, rightful king of the 7 kingdoms. Jon looked at the letter for a moment. Then he looked at Sam. She's already there, he said. Melisandre, Sam said. She arrived at Dragonstone 2 months ago. Stannis' Maester mentioned it in the correspondence about the supply lines. I wasn't sure if it was relevant. I should have told you. It's all right, Jon said. It's good, actually. It means she's already been working on him. He folded the letter. I'm going to Dragonstone after Shadow Tower. Sam made the face for I had hoped that wasn't coming, but I had predicted it. Should I draft the formal Watch delegation request for Mormont to sign? Yes. And write to the Citadel again. I want a Maester certification of the Dragonstone obsidian deposits before I go, so I have the technical authority to make the supply request in writing. Something Stannis can approve with a quill rather than a conversation. I'll have it done by tonight, Sam said. Sam, Jon said. Yes. When I leave for Shadow Tower and then Dragonstone, I need you here, not traveling with me. Here, specifically, managing the supply correspondence and the dragonglass processing, and the ongoing communication with Mance's people. He looked at his friend. You are the most valuable person in this castle for that specific work. Mormont knows it even if he hasn't said it. I need you to know it. Sam had the expression he wore when someone said something true about him that he was still learning to accept without immediately deflecting. He held it this time, just accepted it, with the quiet solidity of someone who had been growing into a different version of himself for 5 months and could now wear it without it feeling borrowed. I'll keep it together, Sam said. Go do whatever needs doing. Jon looked south from the wall, toward the world that was going to need so much from so many people. And he thought about the pieces that were in motion, Robb holding the north, Stannis sitting on a volcanic island above a cave full of obsidian, a red priestess who believed in fire and prophecy, and had already felt something in him like a bell struck underwater, a silver-haired queen somewhere across the sea who had not yet answered his letter but would. He was certain she would. He thought about Ned Stark in the Black Cells, and he allowed himself one moment of the thing he had been keeping very carefully managed, the fear, clean and specific, that even with everything he had changed and set in motion, the world was still capable of doing the unfair thing, still capable of taking people before their time, still capable of the casual brutality that had ended his first life and Ned's and so many others. Then he breathed it out, put it away, picked up the practical version of things, and went back to work. He went down the elevator as the evening light went golden along the wall's southern face, turning the ice amber and rose, and he walked through the yard where the recruits were finishing the day's last session under Thorne's watchful eye. Thorne, who had kept his word with the rigid fidelity of a man for whom keeping his word was a form of identity, who had been difficult and useful in exactly the ratio Jon had predicted, who had come to Jon twice in the past month with operational concerns, delivered through proper channels, and had been listened to both times, and had not seemed to know what to do with that. Gren was teaching a newer recruit the foot position Jon had showed him 4 months ago, speaking with the authority of someone who had internalized the lesson and was passing it forward. Pip was correcting Ollie's grip on a training sword with the quick, precise commentary of someone who had developed genuine skill and the specific pleasure of being able to share it. Ollie. The boy had been different since the morning in the yard, less sealed up, less available to be written on by someone else's narrative. He had come to Jon twice with questions, real ones, the kind that suggested he was trying to work out the shape of something rather than seeking confirmation of a conclusion he'd already reached. Jon had answered both times with the full, honest version rather than the comfortable one, and Ollie had received it each time with the sober attention of someone doing the actual work of changing their mind. It was not finished. None of this was finished. But it was different, and different was everything. Jon stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the people he had spent 5 months forging, not into weapons, exactly, though they were that too, but into something more specific and more valuable. People who trusted him, and whom he had trusted back with the full weight of what he knew, and who had not broken under that weight but had grown into it. He thought about what he'd said to Ned Stark in the Godswood at Winterfell. I need you to be smarter than you were. He had been asking his father to be someone slightly different from himself. He had been asking everyone to be slightly different, Robb, Sansa, Sam, Ollie, Thorne even, to make different choices from the ones that had ended the first time so badly. And the truth, standing in the yard in the amber evening light with the wall at his back, was that he had been asking the same thing of himself, to be smarter, to be present, to stop carrying the grief of what he'd lost as though the weight of it was the only proof the people were real. They were real. They were here. Sansa was alive in King's Landing. Arya was getting better with a sword every day under Syrio Forel's instruction, if Ned had followed through. Robb was riding south right now to work a political problem that in his first life had been a military one, which was already better. Ghost was in the yard below, looking up at him with red eyes that caught the last light. It was not fixed. It was not safe. The ghost grass was growing and the Night King was patient, and the world had 1,000 ways to go wrong that Jon had not predicted and could not prevent. He was one man with a dead man's memories and a Targaryen's blood, and 5 months of preparation against an enemy that had been building for 10,000 years. But he was not alone this time. He turned and put his back to the south and looked north over the top of the wall, past the 600 feet of ancient ice and the long dark distance of the haunted forest, past the Frostfangs and the pale open country beyond them where something cold and patient was moving south by degrees, past the edge of everything that had ever had a name. He had stood here at the end of his first life and watched the darkness and promised it would go differently. He had not made the promise lightly, and he did not hold it lightly now. He held it the way you hold something you have put your full self behind, not with white knuckles and desperation, but with the settled certainty of someone who has already decided, who made the decision in a cold room in Winterfell 5 months ago, and has been living it every day since. The wall said nothing. The darkness beyond said nothing. The wind came off the north in the particular way it had always come off the north, cold and old and patient, and not especially concerned with the plans of living men. Jon Snow looked at it. He did not look away. Ygritte appeared at his side. He heard her. He always heard her now, the specific quality of her footstep that had become as familiar as Ghost's breathing, and she stood beside him and looked north too, and for a while neither of them said anything because the moment didn't need it. Mormont's calling a full assembly tomorrow, she said eventually. He's going to formally announce the passage agreement to the full watch. He asked me to be there. He told me, Jon said. It'll go badly with some of them. Yes, and you'll deal with that. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. You know what I've never understood about Southerners, she said. Tell me. They act like the world is something that happens to them, like the shape of things is fixed and they're just moving around inside it. She looked north. The free folk know that the world is what you make of it. Sometimes literally you put your hands on it and you make it different. She glanced at him. You understand that better than most Southerners. I had good teachers, Jon said. She made the sound that was her version of a laugh, short and real and unpretentious. Flattery, she said. From a Targaryen, that's historical. Everything I do is apparently historical, Jon said. Probably, she agreed. Below them, Castle Black lit its torches. The fires went up one by one along the base of the wall. The habitual evening ritual of people making warmth against the dark. Small and insufficient by any objective measure, and absolutely necessary by every other. Jon watched the lights appear and felt the thing he had been feeling more and more often over the past weeks, not the clean, fierce certainty of a man with a plan, but something quieter and more durable, the thing that sits underneath certainty and holds it up, the thing that has a name only in the kind of language you mostly don't need words for. He was here. The people he loved were mostly alive. The pieces were moving. The wall stood. It was not enough. It was not finished. It was the beginning of a thing that was going to cost more than he could yet calculate. A thing that was going to demand from him, and from everyone around him, things they did not yet know they had. But it was started. It was different from what it had been. The world had a shape it had not had before he woke up that cold morning in Winterfell and breathed pine resin and wood smoke, and understood that he had been given back everything he had lost, and the price of it was everything he had yet to give. He had paid that price every day for 5 months without regret. He intended to keep paying it. The last torch lit below him. The wall held the darkness the way it had always held the darkness, not because it was invincible, but because the people behind it refused to stop standing. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, the man who had died and been given back the morning and everything it contained, looked north one last time into the dark that was coming. Not yet, he said quietly. To the cold, to the patience of 10,000 years, to the dead and the thing that moved them, to every version of the future that ended badly. Not yet, and this time not ever. Ghost pressed against his knee, warm and alive and impossibly white against the gray of the wall, and Ygritte stood at his shoulder, and below them Castle Black burned its small fires against the enormous dark, and the North was awake, and the North remembered, and so did he.